Across different continents, long before written history or modern tools, people shaped stone in ways that still hold it together today. Not just monuments, but entire systems. Walls that absorb earthquakes, cities carved directly from bedrock, and structures placed so precisely they still control space, movement, and meaning. These sites weren't accidents. They were built by people who understood stone, land, and time far better than we usually admit. In this film, we're exploring real prehistoric sites, places where engineering appears long before the technology we expect to see it. When you look at them side by side, a quiet pattern begins to form. The past wasn't primitive, it was deliberate. So slow down, settle in, and let the evidence speak. Men and Toll. On the wind-swept moorlands of Cornwall, where the ground feels older than memory and the horizon never quite settles, there is a small arrangement of stones that quietly resists easy explanation. This is Main and Toll. At first glance, it appears simple. 3 stones standing in a loose line, 2 upright pillars, and between them a circular stone pierced cleanly through its center, as if the rock itself were deliberately opened rather than broken. There is no enclosure wall, no grand platform, no towering monument to signal importance. And yet, this place has never been forgotten. Main and Toll does not dominate the landscape. It sits within it, low and exposed, surrounded by heather, granite outcrops, and a sky that changes constantly. The stones feel less like objects placed here and more like features that belong to the land itself. That impression is intentional. The central hold stone is the focus. It weighs several tons and was shaped from local granite, one of the hardest and most stubborn materials available. Creating a smooth, circular opening through such stone without cracking it requires patience, planning, and an understanding of fracture behavior that goes beyond trial and error. Granite does not respond well to force. It responds to control. The hole is not rough. Its inner surface is worn smooth, not only by time, but by repeated contact. For centuries, people passed through it, crawled through it, turned their bodies sideways and moved carefully, treating the stone not as an obstacle, but as a threshold. This was not symbolic imagination layered on later. It was use. Local traditions record that Main and Toll was associated with healing, particularly for children and for spinal ailments. Passing through the stone was believed to realign the body, restoring balance rather than curing disease outright. Whether or not one accepts the belief, the physical interaction remains undeniable. The stone was designed to be approached. The placement of the 2 upright stones on either side of the hold stone reinforces this. They frame it, guide movement toward it, and define a narrow axis of passage. This is not a random scatter of megaliths. It is a composed space. The alignment of Men and Toll connects it to a broader prehistoric landscape. Nearby are stone circles, standing stones, and ancient pathways that suggest this was once part of a much larger ceremonial or functional system. What remains today may only be a fragment. But even fragments can retain logic. The stones sit on ground that slopes gently, allowing water to drain naturally away. There is no evidence of subsidence or collapse despite thousands of years of exposure. The stones remain upright because they were seated correctly from the beginning. Their bases were prepared. Excavations and surveys indicate that the stones were set into the ground deliberately, with packing stones stabilizing them beneath the surface. This invisible work mattered more than the visible form. Without it, the stones would have tilted, sunk, or fallen long ago. Men and Toll survives because the builders understood the ground. The circular opening itself raises deeper questions. Drilling through granite with primitive tools is slow, risky, and irreversible. A mistake would fracture the stone and render it useless. The builders had to plan the diameter, the placement, and the method in advance. This was not decoration, it was commitment. Some researchers suggest the hole served astronomical or observational purposes, possibly framing specific solar or lunar events. Others see it as symbolic, a representation of transition, birth, or renewal. What matters is that the opening is functional. It allows passage. It allows framing. It allows interaction. Stone here is not passive. It participates. The modest scale of Menontoul is part of what makes it so unsettling. Unlike massive stone circles or towering monoliths, this site does not rely on size to assert importance. It relies on precision, placement, and continued relevance. People returned here long after its original builders were gone. That continuity suggests the site remained meaningful even as cultures changed. The stones did not need explanation carved into them. Their use taught their purpose. Knowledge was transmitted through action rather than text. This is prehistoric intelligence expressed quietly. The surrounding landscape reinforces this reading. Cornwall's granite uplands are harsh, exposed, and unforgiving. Building here required effort without promise of immediate reward. The decision to shape stone so carefully in such a place suggests long-term thinking. These people expected return. Menontoul also challenges a modern assumption about ancient structures. That complexity must be visible to be real. Here, the most complex decisions are invisible. How deep to set the stones, how to distribute weight, how to shape granite without shattering it. The simplicity is deceptive. Standing at the site today, the experience is intimate rather than grand. Wind passes freely. The stones do not block the view. They focus attention instead. You become aware of scale differently. Your body matters here. Your movement matters. That was always the point. In a series exploring prehistoric structures that seem to exceed what we expect from early societies, Menontoul stands as a reminder that advanced understanding does not always produce large monuments. Sometimes it produces precise ones. Structures meant to be used, not admired. The hold stone remains upright not because it was protected, but because it was positioned correctly from the start. The granite opening remains intact, not because it was lucky, but because it was planned. Time tested every decision made here, and those decisions held. Menontoul does not offer dramatic ruins or obvious mystery. It offers something more challenging. It offers evidence that prehistoric builders understood material, ground, and human movement well enough to create places that stayed relevant long after their original context disappeared. Stone shaped with restraint, ground prepared with care, purpose embedded through use. That is the quiet achievement of Menontoul. Not a monument demanding explanation, but a place that continues to function simply by existing, reminding us that the most enduring ancient knowledge is often the least visible, held not in size or spectacle, but in how carefully stone was asked to do its work. Dolmen of Soto. In the low rolling countryside of southwestern Spain, where fields stretch quietly under an open sky and nothing rises sharply from the land, there is a structure almost entirely hidden from view. From the outside, it looks like a gentle earthen mound, easy to mistake for a natural rise shaped by wind and time. This is the Dolmen of Soto. What makes it remarkable is not what it shows, but what it conceals. Beneath the mound lies one of the longest and most carefully engineered megalithic passage tombs in Europe, built more than 5,000 years ago by people who understood stone, space, and orientation with a level of confidence that still feels difficult to explain. The monument stretches nearly 21 meters from entrance to chamber, a long corridor formed by massive upright slabs capped with equally heavy roofing stones. These stones were not stacked casually. Each one was selected, shaped, transported, and placed with precision, creating a passage that remained structurally stable after millennia underground. The decision to bury the structure beneath an earthen mound was not symbolic alone. It was structural intelligence. Covering the stone corridor with compacted earth stabilizes the uprights, distributes weight evenly across the capstones, and protects the interior from temperature extremes, wind erosion, and surface damage. The mound is part of the architecture. Without it, the dolmen would not have survived. The entrance passage narrows gradually as it moves inward. This change in width is subtle but intentional. It controls movement, slows the body, and directs attention forward. You do not rush into the chamber. You progress deliberately, aware of the stone on either side of you. Light fades as you move inward, but it does not disappear completely. The builders understood how daylight would behave inside the passage, particularly during specific times of year. The dolmen is aligned so that sunlight penetrates deep into the interior during key solar moments, briefly illuminating the back of the chamber. This alignment was planned before construction began. You cannot adjust orientation after stones of this size are placed. The interior stones are engraved with lines, symbols, and shapes carved directly into the rock surface. These markings were not added later. They were carved before the stones were erected, which means the builders planned not only the structure, but the experience of being inside it. Once the stones were set upright and buried, the carvings became permanent, sealed into darkness for most of the year. This suggests that visibility was not the primary purpose. Meaning existed whether or not it was constantly seen. Stone here was used as memory. The uprights were set into carefully prepared sockets in the ground, stabilized with packing stones beneath the surface. This invisible work mattered more than the visible stone. Without it, the weight of the capstones would have pushed the uprights inward over time, collapsing the passage. They did not collapse. The dolmen of Soto also reveals an understanding of soil behavior. The earth used to cover the structure was layered deliberately, compacted to prevent water infiltration while allowing slow drainage. Rainwater moves around the mound rather than through it, protecting the interior from flooding. This is passive engineering at a high level. The builders did not rely on channels or artificial barriers. They shaped the landscape itself to perform the work. What is especially striking is the scale of cooperation required. Moving stones of this size without metal tools, wheeled transport, or draft animals required coordination, planning, and shared purpose. The monument could not be built quickly. It likely took years, possibly decades. This was not emergency construction. It was generational investment. The length of the passage also matters. Unlike shorter dolmens meant for limited access, Soto's corridor allows deep penetration into the monument. This suggests repeated use rather than a single burial event. The structure was entered, exited, and remembered over long periods. The dead were not sealed away and forgotten. They were integrated into the landscape. Standing inside the passage today, the experience is controlled and physical. The ceiling presses close overhead. Sound softens. Temperature stabilizes. The outside world fades gradually rather than abruptly. This transition was designed. The builders understood how bodies react to enclosed space, reduced light, and controlled movement. The monument shapes perception as much as it shapes stone. In a series exploring prehistoric structures that challenge modern assumptions, the dolmen of Soto matters because it demonstrates long-term planning executed without visible excess. There is no towering facade, no dramatic stone circle announcing presence. Everything important happens underground. Modern engineering often separates structure from environment. Here, they are inseparable. The mound, the stones, the soil, and the orientation work as a single system. Remove one element and the monument fails. That system still holds. The dolmen does not survive because it was hidden by accident. It survives because concealment was part of the design. The builders anticipated time, weather, and neglect, and they built accordingly. This is not mystery architecture, it is deliberate architecture. The engravings, now protected beneath the earth for thousands of years, remind us that these builders thought beyond immediate visibility. They were creating something meant to last, even if no one was there to see it every day. Meaning was embedded, not displayed. The dolmen of Soto does not ask us to imagine lost machines or unknown technologies. It asks us to recognize planning, cooperation, and deep understanding of material behavior at a time when history often assumes such knowledge did not yet exist. Stone was placed where it could endure. Earth was shaped to protect it. Orientation was fixed to mark time itself. That is why this monument remains intact. Not as a ruin struggling against erosion, but as a structure still performing its original function, holding space, holding memory, and holding together under pressure it was designed to carry. The dolmen of Soto stands as proof that prehistoric builders were not experimenting blindly. They were executing plans that worked. And they worked so well that the structure outlived the culture that built it, remaining silent beneath the fields, doing exactly what it was meant to do: stay. Chiripa. On the southern shores of Lake Titicaca, where the air is thin, the light is sharp, and the landscape feels exposed rather than protected, there is an ancient site that does not rise upward to claim attention. Instead, it moves downward, carving meaning into the ground itself. This is Chiripa. At first glance, Chiripa feels understated. Low platforms, fragmented walls, shallow depressions that appear almost accidental against the open plateau. There are no towering pyramids, no massive monoliths, no obvious symbols of centralized power. And yet, this place represents one of the most important architectural decisions made in the ancient Andes: the decision to build sunken courts. Rather than elevating sacred space above the land, the builders of Chiripa lowered it. They cut into the earth, lined the depression with stone, and created enclosed ceremonial spaces that sit below ground level. This inversion matters because it reflects a fundamentally different understanding of how architecture should interact with landscape, climate, and human presence. At this altitude, the environment is unforgiving. Temperatures shift rapidly. Winds are constant. Sun exposure is intense during the day and disappears quickly at dusk. Building upward would have amplified these stresses. Building downward reduced them. The sunken courts of Chiripa are carefully proportioned rectangular spaces, their walls built from stone blocks fitted tightly without mortar. The stonework is disciplined but restrained, prioritizing stability and alignment over decoration. Corners are reinforced. Floors are leveled precisely. Entry points are narrow and controlled. These were not casual gathering spaces. They were constructed environments designed to shape behavior. Lowering the court below ground level immediately changes sound. Wind noise softens. Voices carry more clearly. The space becomes acoustically contained, allowing speech, chant, and movement to feel focused rather than scattered across the open plateau. This acoustic awareness is not accidental. The builders understood that ritual required separation from the surrounding world, not through walls or roofs, but through elevation change. Temperature behaves differently as well. The sunken courts retain heat longer after sunset and remain cooler during intense midday sun. This creates a more stable microclimate, making longer gatherings possible without physical discomfort. Again, this is not symbolic. It is practical intelligence applied to sacred space. The construction of these courts required careful planning. Cutting into the ground destabilizes surrounding soil unless it is reinforced correctly. The builders lined the excavated walls with stone, creating retaining structures that prevent collapse and erosion. Beneath the floors, compacted layers of soil and stone provide drainage, preventing water accumulation during seasonal rains. Without this preparation, the courts would have filled with mud. They did not. The stones used in the walls were selected for durability and shape rather than size. This allowed precise fitting and reduced the need for large transport efforts. Stability was achieved through geometry and placement, not sheer mass. This reflects a community-scale approach rather than elite command. Chiripa dates to the formative period, long before the rise of Tiwanaku or the Inca. This makes the sophistication of its architecture especially significant. These people were not inheriting monumental traditions. They were inventing spatial solutions from scratch. The sunken courts also reveal a clear social logic. Participation required descent. You did not observe ritual from above. You entered it physically, stepping down into a shared space where hierarchy was minimized and presence was emphasized. Everyone occupied the same ground level. This suggests a communal ritual structure rather than a strictly stratified one. The courts are aligned, carefully within the broader settlement. Their orientation relates to the lake, the surrounding hills, and solar movement across the sky. These alignments are subtle, not dramatic. They guide light and shadow gradually rather than marking single moments. Time here was cyclical, not punctuated. The builders understood that repetition mattered more than spectacle. Evidence suggests that Chiripa's sunken quartz were used repeatedly over centuries. Repairs were made. Stones were reset. Floors were resurfaced. This maintenance indicates that the spaces remained meaningful long after their initial construction. They were not abandoned quickly. This continuity matters because it shows that the design worked. The quartz did not flood. They did not collapse. They did not lose relevance. They remained functional in an environment where poorly planned construction fails quickly. Standing within a sunken court today, the surrounding landscape feels distant, even though it remains fully visible above the walls. The horizon sits higher than you. The sky feels framed. Your awareness shifts inward. That effect was intentional. The builders understood how humans perceive space. Lowering the ground alters posture, sightlines, and attention. The body becomes more aware of enclosure without being confined. This is architectural psychology expressed without theory. In a series exploring prehistoric structures that challenge modern assumptions, Chiripa is essential because it demonstrates that advanced architectural thinking existed in the Andes far earlier than monumental stonework suggests. Intelligence here is not measured by size. It is measured by suitability. The sunken quartz solved multiple problems at once: environmental stress, social cohesion, acoustic control, and ritual focus, using minimal material and maximum understanding. No excess, no unnecessary height, no wasted effort. Just ground shaped deliberately to support human gathering. Chiripa also challenges the idea that complexity must evolve toward verticality. Here, innovation moved downward. Meaning was placed below the surface, protected rather than displayed. This choice reveals confidence. You do not hide what you fear will be forgotten. You place it where it will endure. The sunken quartz endure because they were built to work with the land, not against it. The earth itself became part of the structure, carrying weight, moderating climate, and shaping experience. Stone reinforced what soil already did well. That partnership between material and environment is the true achievement of Chiripa. Not a monument that rises to dominate the horizon, but a space that quietly reshapes how people come together, how they listen, and how they experience meaning. In the broader story of ancient architecture, Chiripa stands as an early and powerful reminder that sophistication does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it is found in the decision to dig rather than build, to enclose without walls, and to create permanence by moving closer to the ground rather than farther from it. The sunken quartz of Chiripa are not mysterious because we lack explanations. They are challenging because they reveal how much ancient people already understood about climate, sound, soil, and human presence, at a time when history often assumes they did not. And as the winds continue to sweep across the shores of Lake Titicaca, these spaces remain where they were placed, holding shape, holding memory, and holding together under the same conditions they were designed to endure. Not by accident, but by knowledge applied quietly, precisely, and early. Rakfet Cave. Along the western slopes of Mount Carmel, where limestone cliffs overlook forested valleys and the Mediterranean air drifts inland, there is a shallow cave that at first appears unremarkable. Its ceiling is low. Its entrance is wide. There are no towering facades or imposing walls, and yet, carved directly into the bedrock floor of this cave, are features that quietly rewrite what we assume about the earliest stages of human planning. This is Rakfet Cave. What makes Rakfet extraordinary is not what was built here, but what was cut here. The cave floor contains dozens of stone mortars carved directly into living limestone. These are not portable tools. They are not vessels that could be moved, replaced, or casually discarded. They are permanent installations. Each mortar is carved with intention, cylindrical, deep, and smooth-walled, shaped to withstand repeated impact without cracking. Creating even one such feature requires patience and foresight. Creating. Many of them in a confined space required coordination, shared purpose, and long-term commitment to a specific place. This was not opportunistic tool use. It was infrastructure. The mortars date to the Natufian period, roughly 13,000 years ago, a time when humans were transitioning from mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles toward more settled patterns of living. This moment in history is often described as experimental or transitional. Rakefet challenges that description. Carving tools into bedrock makes no sense if you plan to leave. Once carved, they cannot travel with you. Their usefulness depends entirely on return. The builders of Rakefet expected to come back, again and again. And they did. Analysis of residues found within the mortars reveals evidence of plant processing, including wild cereals and fermented substances. These mortars were not used once or twice. They were used repeatedly over long periods for activities that required rhythm, consistency, and shared participation, grinding, pounding, mixing. These are communal acts. The placement of the mortars within the cave is also deliberate. They are grouped, not scattered. This grouping suggests coordinated activity rather than individual work. Multiple people could operate simultaneously, facing inward, sharing space and timing. This arrangement matters. It tells us that early communities were organizing labor spatially, not just socially. The cave became a work environment, shaped to support cooperation rather than isolation. The choice of limestone bedrock is significant. Limestone is workable but brittle. Carving deep cylindrical mortars without causing fractures requires controlled technique and understanding of the stone's weaknesses. The builders had to know where they could cut and how deep they could go. Mistakes here would be permanent, yet the mortars remain intact. Some are aligned near the cave walls, others closer to the center, indicating different stages of carving and use. This suggests that the site evolved gradually rather than being executed as a single project. New mortars were added as needs grew. This is growth through continuity. Beyond food processing, Rakefet Cave also served as a burial site. Human graves were cut into the cave floor, some lined with stone and plant material. This overlap between daily activity and burial is not accidental. Life and death occupied the same space. The mortars and the graves coexisted, suggesting that processing food, preparing drink, and honoring the dead were part of the same ritual landscape. The cave was not divided into functional zones the way modern spaces are. It was integrated. This integration changes how we understand early ritual behavior. Rather than isolated ceremonial structures, ritual was embedded into daily activity. Preparing food and drink may have been part of funerary gatherings, reinforcing social bonds through shared labor. The permanence of the stone mortars supports this interpretation. They were not temporary tools brought in for special events. They were part of the cave's identity. Stone here anchored memory. The cave's microenvironment also played a role. Its shallow depth allows light to enter while still providing shelter. Temperature remains relatively stable. Sound is contained but not echoed. These qualities make it suitable for prolonged gatherings without the need for artificial structures. The builders understood this intuitively. They did not reshape the cave dramatically. They adjusted it just enough to serve their needs. The mortars are carved where the rock allows it. Areas prone to cracking are avoided. The ceiling remains untouched. This restraint is telling. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Rakefet Cave stands out because it shows that architectural thinking began far earlier than permanent houses or monumental stonework. Infrastructure came first, before walls, before cities, before temples. People began by fixing tools into the ground itself. This act required confidence in place. It required belief that this cave, this hillside, this community would persist long enough to justify permanent alteration of the landscape. That belief was correct. The mortars are still there, cut cleanly into stone, their edges softened only by time and use. They have outlasted the culture that carved them, surviving climate shifts, environmental change, and the collapse of entire ways of life. They endure because they were carved where stone could carry stress. Rakefet Cave does not present mystery in the dramatic sense. There are no impossible blocks or unexplained machines. What it presents is something more unsettling. Evidence that humans were planning long-term, organizing communal labor, and embedding ritual into fixed places far earlier than traditional timelines suggest. This was not experimentation, it was decision making. The people who carved these mortars understood that permanence creates obligation. Once you cut into bedrock, you commit to return. You commit to maintenance. You commit to memory. They accepted that responsibility. Standing in the cave today, the mortars feel close, human in scale. You can imagine hands moving, tools striking, voices overlapping. The distance between past and present feels unusually small. That closeness is the true legacy of Rakafet. Not a monument meant to impress the future, but a working space meant to sustain community. A place where stone was shaped just enough to support shared life, shared ritual, and shared return. In the long story of human construction, Rakafet Cave reminds us that the first permanent architecture was not built upward into the sky. It was carved downward into the ground. And that choice, to fix tools into stone, to anchor activity to place, marks one of the earliest and most profound shifts in human history. From movement to return, from tools to infrastructure, from temporary presence to enduring place. The stone mortars of Rakafet Cave remain because they were not accidents of use. They were commitments made in stone, and those commitments still hold. Tel Arad. At the edge of the Negev desert, where rainfall is scarce and the land offers little forgiveness to error, a low mound rises quietly above the surrounding plain. It does not dominate the horizon. It does not announce power through height or ornament. And yet, this site represents one of the clearest early examples of how human planning adapted to extreme conditions with remarkable precision. This is Tel Arad. Long before the later Judean fortress that would occupy the hilltop, the lower city of Arad was already established as a fortified Canaanite settlement in the early Bronze Age, more than 5,000 years ago. What survives today is not impressive because it is tall or massive, but because it was correctly placed. Arad was founded in an environment where mistakes are not corrected slowly. They fail quickly. Walls crack. Water disappears. Settlements collapse. Survival here required careful understanding of terrain, access, and control long before stone was laid. The Canaanite city of Arad was deliberately positioned to oversee trade routes moving between the Dead Sea region, the Negev, and the Mediterranean coast. This location offered strategic visibility, but visibility alone was not enough. The city needed to endure. That endurance began with the ground. The fortification system at Tel Arad consists of thick stone walls reinforced with mud brick superstructures, resting on carefully prepared foundations. These foundations were not uniform. Their depth and composition change according to slope, soil stability, and load requirements. This variability matters. It shows that the builders did not follow a rigid template. They adjusted their construction based on conditions beneath each section of wall. Where the ground was weaker, foundations were deeper and broader. Where bedrock was closer to the surface, walls could be seated more directly. This is adaptive engineering. The city wall formed a complete enclosure, not only defining space, but controlling movement. Gates were limited in number and placed deliberately where terrain allowed monitoring and defense without overextending the structure. These gates were reinforced heavily, recognizing that openings are always points of failure. Inside the walls, the city followed a clear plan. Streets were laid out to guide runoff away from living areas. Buildings were clustered to reduce exposure to wind and heat. Open spaces were controlled rather than expansive. Nothing here was casual. One of the most revealing aspects of Tel Arad is its water management system. There are no rivers nearby. Wells are deep and unreliable. The city depended on rainfall, which is infrequent and unpredictable. To survive, the builders created cisterns lined with plaster, designed to capture and store water efficiently while minimizing loss. These cisterns were integrated into the urban plan from the beginning. They were not additions. Water channels guided rain from rooftops and courtyards into storage areas. Surfaces were angled deliberately. Overflow was managed to prevent erosion near foundations. This level of planning indicates that the builders understood water as a structural force as much as a resource. Uncontrolled water destroys walls faster than enemies. The fortifications also served a psychological role. In an open desert landscape, a walled city creates certainty. It defines inside and outside, safety and exposure. The walls of Arad were thick enough to absorb impact, resist erosion, and support long-term occupation without constant rebuilding. Archaeological layers showed that the city was rebuilt multiple times on the same footprint. When structures failed or were destroyed, new ones rose where the old had stood. This reuse tells us that the foundational logic was sound enough to trust repeatedly. The builders did not abandon the site lightly. Within the city, evidence suggests specialized areas for storage, administration, and ritual. Even in this early period, Arad was not a random cluster of houses. It was an organized settlement with differentiated space. This organization required shared understanding. There is no indication of monumental palaces or elite compounds dominating the city. Instead, the emphasis is on collective survival rather than display. Walls mattered more than decoration. Water mattered more than ornament. This prioritization reveals a pragmatic worldview. The later history of Tel Arad adds another layer to its significance. Centuries after the Canaanite city declined, a new fortress was built atop the mound by the Kingdom of Judah. Remarkably, the later builders reused earlier foundations where possible, adapting them to new architectural needs. This reuse confirms something important. The original Canaanite planning was not primitive. It was robust enough to support later construction without fundamental redesign. Stone placed thousands of years earlier still performed its function. The Judean fortress also included a small temple, oriented carefully and built with attention to purity and separation. This shows that Arad remained meaningful long after its original builders were gone. The location itself carried authority. That authority came from reliability. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Tel Arad stands out because it demonstrates that advanced planning did not require monumental scale or imperial ambition. It required understanding the relationship between land, resource, and risk. The builders of Arad were not experimenting. They were solving problems. They knew where walls would fail if placed incorrectly. They knew how water would behave across stone and soil. They knew that survival depended on preparation, not reaction. Standing at Tel Arad today, the remains appear low and fragmentary. Walls barely rise above the ground. Foundations are exposed rather than hidden. And yet, this visibility makes the intelligence of the site easier to read. You can see where stones were thickened. You can trace drainage paths. You can follow the logic of movement and enclosure. Nothing here is mysterious once you pay attention. That is precisely what makes it unsettling, because it reveals that people living more than 5,000 years ago understood principles that are still taught in modern engineering. Load distribution, environmental adaptation, redundancy, and maintenance. They did not write treatises. They built answers. The Canaanite fortress at Tel Arad does not demand awe. It earns respect. It stands as evidence that early urban societies were capable of disciplined planning under conditions where failure meant abandonment. And because their decisions were correct, the site endured long enough to be reused, reimagined, and remembered. Not because it was grand, but because it worked. Stone placed with intent. Walls built for reality, not display. A city designed to survive, in a place that offered no mercy. That is the real achievement of Tel Arad, a fortress that did not rely on legend or exaggeration, but on understanding, and in doing so, quietly proved that ancient builders were far more capable than history often admits. Tel Dan. At the northern edge of the Levant, where freshwater springs emerge from the foothills of Mount Hermon, and the land shifts from arid plains to fertile basin, there is an ancient city whose greatest achievement is not a palace, a temple, or a monument meant to be seen from afar. Its greatest achievement is restraint. This is Tel Dan, and what defines it are its massive stone and earth ramparts, fortifications built not to impress, but to endure in a landscape where control of water, movement, and access meant survival. Unlike cities raised on exposed hilltops, Tel Dan occupies a low-lying position near abundant springs. This made it valuable, but also vulnerable. Flat terrain offers little natural defense. There are no steep slopes to discourage approach, no cliffs to restrict movement. Any protection here had to be built deliberately, from the ground up. The solution was not height, it was mass. During the Middle Bronze Age, the inhabitants of Tel Dan constructed enormous ramparts composed of stone foundations supporting thick earthen embankments reinforced with mud brick. These were not walls in the later vertical sense. They were engineered slopes, wide, heavy, and carefully layered, designed to absorb force rather than resist it directly. This distinction matters. A vertical wall cracks when pressure concentrates. A sloped rampart distributes stress across its entire body. At Tel Dan, the builders chose a form that works with gravity instead of opposing it. The base of the rampart consists of large field stones laid in broad courses, creating a stable platform that locks the structure into the ground. Above this stone footing rises a massive earthen fill, compacted in layers, each one stabilized to prevent slippage and erosion. Mud brick elements were integrated strategically, not as surface decoration, but as structural reinforcement. This was not crude piling. It was controlled accumulation. The ramparts encircle the city in a continuous system, forming a defensive envelope rather than isolated barriers. Their width is more striking than their height. In places, the embankment spans dozens of meters from base to crest, making direct assault impractical even without towering walls. An attacker would have to climb upward under exposure for an extended distance, losing momentum long before reaching the top. This was defensive geometry. Water management is central to understanding why these ramparts still exist. Tel Dan receives significant rainfall compared to surrounding regions, and uncontrolled water would quickly erode an earthen structure of this size. The builders anticipated this. The slopes were shaped to shed water gradually rather than channel it aggressively. Surface angles were calibrated to slow runoff, reducing erosion. Stone revetments protected vulnerable edges. Drainage paths were implicit in the form itself. There was no need for complex channels. The rampart was the system. This approach required deep understanding of soil behavior. Earth compacts, settles, and responds to moisture over time. Poorly prepared embankments slump or collapse within years. The ramparts of Tel Dan remained stable for centuries. They were maintained, resurfaced, and reinforced across generations, indicating that the original design was sound enough to justify continued investment. The gates of Tel Dan reveal another layer of intelligence. Rather than cutting simple openings through the rampart, the builders integrated gate complexes into the mass itself. These entrances were recessed, flanked, and reinforced, creating controlled points of access without weakening the overall structure. One of the most famous features of Tel Dan is its arched gate, built from mud brick atop stone foundations. While the arch itself often receives attention, it is the surrounding rampart that made the gate viable. Without the stabilizing mass around it, the arch would not have survived. The city's layout inside the ramparts reflects the same logic. Streets follow gentle curves rather than rigid grids, responding to the shape of the fortification. Buildings cluster toward the interior, leaving space near the ramparts for movement, repair, and reinforcement. The city was designed to support its defenses, not compete with them. What makes Tel Dan especially important in a series examining ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions is the scale of foresight involved. These ramparts were not built for a single generation. The labor required was enormous. The payoff was not immediate spectacle, but long-term security. This only makes sense if the builders expected continuity. They believed this city would endure long enough to justify shaping the land itself. The materials used reflect practical intelligence rather than prestige. Stone was employed where compression mattered most. Earth was used where volume and energy absorption were required. Mud brick served as a binding element, not a decorative surface. Each material did what it did best. This hierarchy of material use is a hallmark of mature engineering thinking. Over time, political control of Tel Dan changed hands multiple times. New rulers occupied the city. cultures shifted, yet the ramparts remained relevant. Later, inhabitants reused them rather than replacing them, adapting gates and surface features without dismantling the core structure. That reuse is telling. It means the ramparts were never obsolete. Even when military technology evolved, the fundamental logic of mass and slope remained effective. The fortifications did not depend on a specific weapon system or tactic. They depended on physics. Standing near the ramparts today, their scale is easier to feel than to see. They do not rise sharply, they spread. The land itself feels thickened, as if the city pressed downward into the earth to make itself harder to remove. This sensation is intentional. The ramparts blur, the line between natural terrain and human construction. They do not announce where nature ends and architecture begins. They merge the two. This merging is the secret to their longevity. In contrast to later stone walls that collapsed when maintenance stopped, Tel Dan's earthen ramparts survived neglect precisely because they were designed to weather time. Erosion softens edges rather than destroying structure. Settling stabilizes rather than destabilizes. Failure modes were anticipated and minimized. The ramparts also shaped how the city was perceived psychologically. From outside, Tel Dan did not appear as a fragile settlement behind thin walls. It appeared as a raised, consolidated mass, difficult to read, difficult to approach, and difficult to undermine. Defense here was not theatrical, it was discouraging. In the broader context of ancient architecture, Tel Dan challenges the assumption that technological advancement must express itself through vertical monumentality. Here, intelligence expressed itself horizontally, through earthworks that demanded patience rather than spectacle. This approach appears in other ancient cultures, but Tel Dan represents one of its clearest and earliest expressions in the Levant. It tells us that ancient builders were not always trying to build higher. Sometimes, they chose to build heavier. The massive stone ramparts of Tel Dan survive because they were never asked to do more than they could. They were not pushed to visual extremes. They were given generous margins of safety, built thick enough that time could work on them without destroying them. That generosity is rare in architecture. It requires confidence. The builders of Tel Dan had that confidence, and they embedded it into the ground itself. In a series devoted to prehistoric and ancient structures that force us to reconsider early engineering knowledge, Tel Dan stands as a quiet correction. It shows that intelligence does not always leave behind dramatic ruins or towering silhouettes. Sometimes it leaves behind landscapes that simply refuse to fail. The ramparts of Tel Dan do not ask us to imagine lost technologies or unknown machines. They ask us to recognize something more subtle and more convincing, an understanding of material behavior, environmental forces, and long-term use that was already fully developed thousands of years ago. Stone placed where it mattered most. Earth shaped to carry stress. A city protected by physics rather than fear. That is the real achievement of Tel Dan's massive ramparts. Not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a lesson waiting to be noticed. One that reminds us that the most successful ancient structures are often the ones that blend into the land so completely that we forget how much thought it took to make them stay. Grianan of Eilich. On a high green hill overlooking Lough Swilly and Lough Foyle, where the land of northwest Ireland opens wide and the horizon feels unusually distant, there stands a circular stone structure whose presence is felt long before it is fully understood. This is the Grianan of Eilich. From a distance it appears solid, quiet, and self-contained, as if it has always belonged to the hill it crowns. There is no dramatic rise, no sharp angles, no towering silhouette meant to intimidate. Instead, the structure settles into the summit, holding its position with a confidence that feels earned rather than imposed. The Grianan is often described as a hill fort, but that term only partially explains what this place is. It is fortified, yes, but it is also ceremonial, symbolic, and deeply tied to landscape in ways that go beyond defense alone. The structure consists of thick, circular stone walls forming a ring more than 20 meters in diameter, rising several meters high, and enclosing an interior space that feels deliberately proportioned rather than expansive. The walls are built using dry stone techniques, with carefully selected stones, stacked and interlocked without mortar. This construction method is not primitive. It is deliberate. Dry stone walls survive not because stones are piled high, but because weight is distributed intelligently. Each stone presses downward and inward, locking the structure together through gravity rather than binding material. The slight inward curve of the walls at Grianan is subtle but critical, helping the structure resist outward collapse over time. The walls are not uniform in thickness. They are thickest at the base, where load is greatest, and gradually reduce as they rise. This tapering is not easily visible from the outside, but it is felt inside, where the wall passages narrow slightly as they ascend. Within the thickness of the walls are stairways and passages built into the structure itself. These are not later additions. They are integral to the design, allowing movement upward without weakening the outer face. This internal circulation shows a sophisticated understanding of how to carve usable space into mass without compromising stability. From the summit, the view is commanding. The Grianan overlooks multiple valleys, waterways, and natural routes of movement. This visibility explains part of its importance. Control of sightlines meant control of territory, communication, and symbolic dominance. But visibility alone does not explain the effort invested here. The stones used to build the Grianan were gathered from the surrounding region and transported uphill, a task requiring coordination and time. There is no nearby quarry supplying neatly shaped blocks. Stones were selected for fit rather than uniformity, chosen for how they would lock into place within the wall. This required experience. The builders understood which stones could carry load, which could fill gaps, and which would fracture under pressure. Mistakes here would be costly, because once a dry stone wall begins to fail, it fails progressively. The fact that the Grianan still stands indicates that those mistakes were largely avoided. The structure's circular form is central to its endurance. Circles distribute force evenly, eliminating corners where stress concentrates. In an environment subject to wind, rain, and freeze-thaw cycles, this matters enormously. Ireland's climate is not gentle on stone. Moisture penetrates joints. Frost expands cracks. Poorly planned walls collapse within generations. The Grianan resists this not through mass alone, but through geometry. The entrance to the Grianan is narrow and controlled, forcing movement into a single point. This is a defensive feature, but it is also symbolic. Entry here is intentional. You do not wander inside accidentally. Once inside, the space feels enclosed but not oppressive. The walls rise around you, blocking wind and focusing sound. The interior becomes a place of gathering, speech, and presence rather than isolation. This dual function matters. The Grianan was not only a stronghold, it was a place of assembly, ceremony, and authority. Historical tradition associates it with kingship and inauguration rituals, suggesting that power here was displayed through position and permanence rather than excess ornament. The structure itself communicates stability. There is no decoration carved into the stone, no inscriptions, no reliefs explaining purpose. Meaning was expressed through form, placement, and continued use rather than text. This absence of inscription is not a limitation. It is a choice. The Grianan sits within a landscape already rich with prehistoric activity. Earlier enclosures and ritual sites exist nearby, indicating that this hill was significant long before the visible structure was built. The builders were not choosing an empty place. They were claiming an old one. This layering of significance is important. When societies build on sites already charged with meaning, they are not just constructing architecture. They are anchoring themselves into memory. The stone walls of the Grianan formalize that anchoring. Archaeological evidence suggests that the structure we see today may incorporate multiple phases of construction and rebuilding. This does not weaken its significance. It strengthens it. Rebuilding implies value. It implies that when walls failed or were damaged, effort was made to restore them rather than abandon the site. That choice speaks to function that extended beyond immediate utility. The internal stairways lead to wall tops that once allowed movement around the perimeter. From here, the builder's understanding of balance becomes even clearer. The walls are thick enough to walk upon safely, yet not so massive that they lose coherence. Everything here sits within tolerances. The structure does not push material to its breaking point. It leaves margin for weather, time, and neglect. This margin is why it survived periods of abandonment and reuse. When later historical events damaged the Grianan, including documented destruction and reconstruction, the core logic of the structure remained intact. Later builders did not reinvent it. They followed its original principles. This continuity tells us that the design worked. Standing at the Grianan today, the experience is grounded rather than dramatic. Wind moves freely outside, but inside the enclosure it softens. Sound carries differently. The hill below feels distant, as if the structure lifts you slightly away from everyday space without removing you from the land entirely. This controlled separation is a form of architectural intelligence. The builders understood how enclosure affects perception. They knew how walls shape attention, how height alters authority, and how placement creates meaning without explanation. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Grianan of Eilig matters because it demonstrates how much could be achieved with stone alone, without mortar, without metal reinforcement, and without monumental scale. This is not a ruin of ambition. It is a structure of judgment. Every stone had to justify its place. Every wall had to support itself. There was no room for excess. The environment would punish mistakes quickly. The fact that the Grianan endured tells us that the builders were not guessing. They were applying knowledge refined over generations. This hill fort does not suggest lost technologies or mysterious tools. It suggests something more grounded and more difficult to dismiss. That ancient builders understood physics, geometry, and landscape deeply enough to create structures that could survive without constant intervention. They did not build to impress the future. They built to hold the present. It stands not as an unanswered question, but as a quiet statement that long before modern engineering language existed, people already knew how to make stone, land, and purpose align in ways that time itself would struggle to undo. And as the winds continue to move across the Donegal Hills, the Grianan remains where it was placed, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Samshvildi, at the edge of a deep river canyon in southern Georgia, where steep basalt cliffs fall sharply into the Crami River and the land narrows into a natural stronghold, there is a fortress whose strength comes not from height or ornament, but from the sheer certainty of how it was placed. This is Samshvildi. From above, the site looks almost accidental, as if the land itself tightened into defense without human intervention. The plateau is narrow, the drop-offs are severe. Movement is limited naturally by the terrain. But what transforms this place from a dramatic landscape into a lasting stronghold is stone, not shaped delicately, not refined for appearance, but assembled with a confidence that borders on refusal. The Cyclopean fortifications of Samshvilde are among the most imposing examples of prehistoric stonework in the Caucasus. Massive blocks, some weighing several tons, are fitted together without mortar, forming walls that feel less like construction and more like geology rearranged. These stones were not quarried cleanly, they were selected. Cyclopean masonry relies on understanding weight, friction, and gravity rather than precision cutting. The stones at Samshvilde are irregular, but their placement is anything but random. Each block is positioned so that its mass locks into those around it, transferring load downward and inward rather than outward. This method resists collapse naturally. The walls follow the edge of the plateau closely, aligning themselves with cliffs rather than fighting them. Where the land already falls away sharply, the fortifications are minimal or absent. Where access is possible, the walls thicken dramatically. This selective construction shows strategic intelligence. The builders did not waste effort where nature already defended the site. They concentrated stone only where human movement could threaten it. This economy of labor suggests long experience with landscape rather than experimental building. The foundation work at Samshvilde is especially revealing. The massive stones are seated directly onto bedrock or compacted substrate, prepared carefully to prevent shifting. There is no attempt to level the ground artificially. Instead, the stones adapt to the surface beneath them, conforming to irregularities rather than erasing them. This choice reduces long-term instability. Leveling introduces weakness. Adapting preserves strength. The walls themselves vary in thickness, sometimes exceeding several meters. This is not overbuilding. It is response. In areas where pressure would concentrate, near gates, corners, or changes in elevation, the walls swell, absorbing stress and resisting outward force. Corners, in particular, are handled with care. Rather than sharp right angles, the walls curve subtly or interlock stones deeply, avoiding points where fracture would propagate. This is Cyclopean logic applied thoughtfully. The entrances to Samschvilde are narrow and indirect. You do not approach the interior in a straight line. Access routes bend, constrict, and expose anyone entering to observation from above. These passages are not decorative, they are filters. Movement through the fortress was controlled long before any gate or door was reached. Architecture itself did the work of defense. Inside the fortifications, space opened slightly, but never generously. The plateau does not allow sprawling construction. Buildings cluster inward, leaving circulation paths along the inner wall for movement, repair, and surveillance. This inward compression reinforces the defensive logic. The builders understood that a fortress is not a city. It is a mechanism. Every element must support the core function of control, endurance, and resistance. Samschvilde's Cyclopean walls date back to the Bronze Age, long before later medieval fortifications reshaped the region. This places their construction in a period often assumed to lack advanced architectural planning. The stones disagree. Moving blocks of this size requires organization. Placing them correctly requires experience. Doing both in a location this difficult requires certainty that the result will matter for generations. This was not short-term thinking. The builders of Samschvilde expected return. They expected threat. They expected continuity. The canyon environment adds another layer of complexity. Wind accelerates along cliff edges. Water erodes stone from below. Freeze-thaw cycles exploit weaknesses relentlessly. Any mistake in stone placement would be punished quickly. Yet the walls remain. They remain because Cyclopean masonry does not rely on delicate tolerances. It relies on mass and friction. As stones settle slightly over time, they tighten rather than loosen. Gravity becomes reinforcement rather than enemy. This is why such walls often survive earthquakes better than later, more refined masonry. Samschvilde also reveals an understanding of psychological defense. The sheer scale of the stones discourages approach, before any physical barrier is tested. The walls feel immovable, not because they are tall, but because they appear inseparable from the land. You do not feel you are attacking a wall. You feel you are challenging the cliff itself. This effect is deliberate. The fortress communicates permanence through inevitability. It suggests that resistance is not only dangerous, but pointless. Later cultures recognized this value. Samschvilde was reused, rebuilt, and occupied across centuries by different powers, each adapting the site without dismantling its prehistoric core. Medieval structures sit atop or alongside Cyclopean foundations, trusting stone placed thousands of years earlier to continue doing its work. This reuse is critical evidence. It shows that later builders recognized the superiority of the original placement. They did not replace it. They respected it. Standing along the edge of the fortifications today, the experience is not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It is heavy. The stones absorb sound. The wind feels sharper. The drop below commands attention. Your body understands the logic before your mind does. This is architecture that communicates physically. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Samschvilde matters because it demonstrates that early builders were not simply stacking stone. They were reading terrain, predicting failure, and choosing solutions that minimized long-term risk. There are no inscriptions here explaining intent. There are no reliefs glorifying rulers. The message is structural. Everything about Samschvilde suggests builders who understood that permanence does not come from refinement, but from alignment. alignment with gravity, with terrain, and with time. Cyclopean masonry is often dismissed as crude because it lacks polish. Samschwilde shows why that dismissal is wrong. The irregularity is not ignorance, it is adaptation. Perfect. Blocks crack. Irregular blocks lock. This understanding appears again and again in the world's most enduring prehistoric fortifications, from the Mediterranean to the Caucasus. Samschwilde belongs to this global tradition, not as an outlier, but as one of its clearest expressions. The fortress was not meant to be admired closely. It was meant to be left standing. And it succeeded. Even after abandonment, erosion, and partial collapse, the core walls remain stable. Stones have shifted minimally. The structure has not unraveled. It holds because it was built to accept time rather than resist it. In modern construction, walls often fail when maintenance stops. Samschwilde fails slowly, gracefully, if at all. Weather rounds edges. Vegetation grows. The structure adapts without losing integrity. This is resilience built into form. The Cyclopean fortifications of Samschwilde do not force us to imagine lost technologies or advanced machines. They force us to reconsider how much knowledge can exist without refinement, without writing, and without spectacle. The builders understood stone. They understood land. And they understood that the most reliable way to secure a place is to make it indistinguishable from the ground it occupies. Samschwilde remains because it was never fragile. It was heavy enough to settle, flexible enough to adjust, placed carefully enough to stay. That is the lesson embedded in these walls. Not a mystery of the past, but a reminder that intelligence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself by refusing to disappear. And as the canyon continues to cut deeper, and the river continues to move far below, the Cyclopean fortifications of Samschwilde remain fixed where they were set, still performing their original task without instruction or repair. Dwarfy Stain. On the island of Hoy, one of the most remote and least forgiving landscapes in the Orkney archipelago, there is a single block of stone that feels profoundly out of place. It does not rise from the ground like a standing stone, nor is it assembled from multiple pieces. It lies alone, isolated on open moorland, shaped not by stacking or lifting, but by carving inward. This is the Dwarfy Stain. At first sight, it looks like a massive erratic boulder left behind by retreating ice. It is large, rough on the outside, and visually unimpressive when compared to nearby stone circles or chambered cairns. But once you approach it, the anomaly becomes clear. This stone is hollow. Carved directly into a single block of red sandstone is a doorway, a passage, and an interior chamber with stone-cut beds. Not built, not assembled, excavated from one solid mass. There is nothing else like it in Northern Europe. The Dwarfy Stain dates to the Neolithic period, roughly 5,000 years ago. At that time, most burial structures in Orkney were constructed from multiple slabs arranged into chambers and covered with cairns. The builders of the Dwarfy Stain chose a completely different approach. They removed stone instead of moving it. This decision immediately raises questions. Carving into a single boulder offers no margin for error. A crack in the wrong place, a misjudged strike, or internal weakness in the stone would ruin the entire project. Unlike assembled tombs, there is no opportunity to replace a failed component. Everything depends on the first cut. The entrance is small and precisely defined, just large enough to allow a body to pass through. It leads into a narrow passage that opens into a rectangular chamber. On either side of the chamber are two raised stone platforms, carved directly from the rock itself. These are not symbolic shapes. They are functional surfaces. The chamber ceiling is low but stable. The walls are straight. The corners are controlled. The interior feels deliberate, not improvised. Every surface bears the marks of stone tools applied patiently, repeatedly, over long periods. Sandstone is softer than granite, but it is unpredictable. It fractures along planes that are not always visible. The builders had to understand the stone intimately before committing to excavation. They could not see inside it. They had to trust experience. The exterior of the stone was left largely untouched. There was no attempt to shape it into a monument, no effort to impose symmetry or visibility. All meaning was placed inside, sealed from view once the entrance stone was set in place. This inversion matters. The dwarfy stain was not meant to be seen. It was meant to be entered. The tomb's location is also unusual. It does not sit within a cemetery, a ritual complex, or a settlement cluster. It stands alone, exposed to wind, rain, and long winter darkness. This isolation suggests that its placement was intentional rather than convenient. The builders chose distance. From this position, the surrounding land feels expansive and empty. Sound travels far. The sky dominates. The stone becomes a fixed point in an otherwise fluid landscape. Returning here would have been an act of memory, not accident. Inside the chamber, the space is intimate. You cannot stand upright. You must crouch or kneel. Movement is slow and controlled. This physical constraint shapes behavior immediately. The tomb dictates posture. This suggests that the interior was designed for specific acts rather than general access. The carved stone beds imply placement of bodies or offerings in defined positions. This was not a communal space. It was precise. The fact that 2 stone beds exist raises further questions. Most Neolithic tombs emphasize collective burial over individual distinction. The dwarfy stain seems to mark differentiation within enclosure, whether symbolic, social, or ritual. We do not know the answer. What we do know is that this differentiation was carved permanently into stone. The entrance was originally sealed by a stone slab, now lost. Once closed, the interior would have been completely dark, silent, and inaccessible without deliberate reopening. This was not a space meant for frequent visitation. It was meant for finality. The absence of decoration inside the tomb is striking. No carvings, no symbols, no visual narrative. The stone itself carries meaning through form and effort rather than imagery. The act of carving was the statement. The dwarfy stain also preserves something rare: evidence of prehistoric graffiti. Runic inscriptions from much later periods were carved into the exterior, showing that the stone continued to attract attention long after its original purpose was forgotten. Later, people recognized it as different. They did not ignore it. This continuity of notice suggests that the stone maintained presence even without cultural memory. Itoi remained a landmark, a curiosity, a point of focus in an otherwise open landscape. From a structural perspective, the tomb's survival is remarkable. Carving hollow space into a single stone introduces stress concentrations. Over time, weathering could exploit cracks, causing collapse. Yet the interior remains intact. This tells us the stone was chosen carefully. The builders likely tested it before carving. They may have examined natural fractures, grain direction, and surface soundness. Only a suitable boulder would justify the effort. Once carving began, progress would have been slow. Stone tools remove material incrementally. Dust accumulates. Visibility is limited. The work would have required planning to ensure ventilation and waste removal. This was not casual labor. It was sustained commitment. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, the dwarfy stain stands apart because it represents a choice that seems inefficient, risky, and unnecessary, unless permanence was the primary goal. Assembled tombs can collapse if slabs shift, cairns erode, entrances fail. A monolithic tomb, carved from a single stone, eliminates many of those failure points. If done correctly, it lasts. The builders traded effort for certainty. Standing beside the dwarfy stain today, the experience is quiet and restrained. There is no spectacle, no scale meant to overwhelm. The stone feels heavy, grounded, uninterested in attention. Its power comes from refusal. It refuses to explain itself easily. It refuses to display meaning outwardly. It refuses to decay the way lighter structures do. This refusal is what makes it unsettling. The dwarfy stain does not suggest lost technologies or impossible tools. It suggests decision-making that prioritized durability over convenience, inward meaning over outward display, and certainty over speed. The builders did not need to build bigger. they needed to build once. By carving into a single stone, they ensured that what they created would remain as long as the stone itself remained. And in the Orkney climate, where stone dominates the landscape, that is a long time. The tomb remains because it was never fragile. It was not assembled. And carving, once completed, leaves very little room for failure. The dwarfy stane stands today not as a grand monument, but as a quiet assertion that Neolithic people understood material well enough to take risks modern builders would often avoid. They trusted the stone. They committed fully. And because of that, this solitary carved block still lies where it was shaped, holding its hollow space intact, carrying silence inside it, and continuing to remind us that some of the most durable ancient architecture was created not by adding stone to stone, but by removing everything that didn't need to be there. Valeron Caves. On the northern coast of Gran Canaria, where volcanic cliffs rise sharply above ravines carved by seasonal water, there is a honeycombed rock face that looks less like architecture and more like a living surface shaped by countless deliberate decisions. This is the Valeron Caves, also known as the Cenobio de Valeron. From a distance, the site appears chaotic. Hundreds of cavities puncture the cliff, stacked irregularly across multiple levels, without symmetry or obvious pattern. But this impression fades quickly when you understand what these spaces were made for. And that distinction changes everything. The Valeron Caves are a massive communal granary complex carved directly into volcanic tuff, created by the indigenous Canarian population long before European contact. This was not a defensive structure or a ceremonial monument. It was infrastructure, built to protect food, manage risk, and ensure survival in an island environment where failure meant famine. Carving storage chambers into a cliff is a strategic choice. Elevated placement protects against pests, flooding, and accidental damage. The rock itself stabilizes temperature and humidity, slowing spoilage and preserving grain far longer than surface structures could. This was controlled preservation. Each cavity was carved with intention. Some are small, others surprisingly deep. Many include carved ledges, lip edges, or ceiling grooves, suggesting that doors or stone plugs once closed them. These were not open niches. They were sealed containers. The sheer number of chambers tells us that this was not an individual household effort. The Valeron Caves represent collective planning on a scale that required shared rules, access control, and trust. Not everyone stored food wherever they wanted. This system required governance. The arrangement of the chambers follows the structure of the cliff rather than imposed geometry. Where the rock is stable, chambers cluster densely. Where fractures or weaknesses appear, spacing increases. The builders understood the stone well enough to avoid catastrophic collapse. Volcanic tuff is workable, but fragile. Poor carving spreads cracks rapidly. The fact that these caves remain intact suggests that the builders cut conservatively, prioritizing stability over maximizing space. This restraint matters. The entrances to the granary complex were limited and difficult to access. Reaching the chambers required climbing, likely using ropes or wooden ladders. This controlled access protected stored food and reduced theft, while also reinforcing social oversight. Food security was not casual. It was enforced by design. Inside the chambers, surfaces were left relatively smooth. Rough stone traps moisture and pests. Smooth walls discourage insects and reduce contamination. These details suggest that the builders understood long-term storage behavior through experience rather than theory. They knew what failed, and they corrected it in stone. The Valeron Caves also revealed something often overlooked in ancient architecture, an understanding of surplus. You do not build storage on this scale unless you expect more than immediate consumption. This implies planned agriculture, coordinated harvests, and distribution systems that extended beyond family units. This was not subsistence living. It was managed abundance. The cliff itself became a ledger. Each chamber represented stored labor, delayed consumption, and future security. The granary turned time into something tangible, grain held in rock until it was needed. This concept is foundational to complex societies. The builders of Valeron did not leave written records, but the architecture itself records decision-making clearly. It shows anticipation of drought, variability, and seasonal failure. It shows preparation rather than reaction. The surrounding landscape reinforces this reading. Gran Canaria's interior is rugged, with limited, arable land and unpredictable rainfall. Concentrating storage in one protected location reduced risk while increasing social cohesion. Everyone depended on the same system. This dependency required trust, but also oversight. Control of access to the granary likely reflected social hierarchy, ritual authority, or communal regulation. Architecture here enforced social order quietly. No walls, no guards, just height, stone, and difficulty. From a structural perspective, the Valeron caves demonstrate impressive understanding of cliff stability. Carving too deeply or too closely would compromise the entire face. Instead, the chambers are staggered vertically and horizontally, distributing stress across the rock mass. The cliff remains intact because it was never overworked. Time tested this decision repeatedly. Earthquakes, erosion, and centuries of abandonment did not cause catastrophic failure. The cavities remain, their edges softened but their form intact. This endurance was not accidental. Standing beneath the cliff today, the scale becomes clear. What appears chaotic from afar resolves into layered logic up close. Every chamber exists where the rock allowed it. Every void respects the limits of the stone. This is architecture shaped by listening rather than domination. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Valeron caves matter because they shift focus away from monuments of power toward systems of survival. They show that advanced planning does not always express itself through temples or fortresses. Sometimes it expresses itself through food. The builders invested enormous effort into something that was meant to be invisible once filled. Stored grain does not attract attention. It does not inspire awe. It simply keeps people alive. That choice reveals priorities. It tells us that intelligence here was applied to continuity rather than display. The cliff was not reshaped to glorify rulers or gods. It was reshaped to protect tomorrow. The name Cenobio, applied later, reflects misunderstanding. This was not a monastery. It was something more practical and, in many ways, more advanced. A centralized storage system embedded into geology. This embedding is why it survived. Surface granaries rot. Wooden structures burn. Stone-cut storage endures. The Valeron caves remain because they were built where decay could not reach easily. They represent one of the clearest examples of prehistoric risk management preserved in stone. They do not ask us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten machines. They ask us to recognize planning, discipline, and cooperation expressed quietly through architecture. Every cavity is a decision. Every sealed chamber is trust deferred. Every surviving wall is proof that the system worked. As you stand before the cliff today, it does not demand attention. It waits. The voids remain open, no longer filled with grain, but still carrying the logic that created them. They remind us that some of the most important ancient structures were never meant to be admired, only relied upon. And in that reliance, the Valeron caves revealed something essential about the people who carved them. They did not build for the moment. They built for the season that might fail. And because of that foresight, their stone still holds space for a future they carefully prepared for. Even if they never imagined we would one day be standing below it, trying to understand how much they already knew. Great Temple of Yeha. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, where plateaus rise gradually and the air feels thin and steady, there is a stone building that seems to exist outside the usual timelines assigned to African architecture. It does not announce itself with height or decoration. It does not rely on ruin to claim importance. It stands because it was built to stand. This is the Great Temple of Yeha. Dating to around the 1st millennium BCE, Yeha is often described as pre-Aksumite, a term that quietly understates what is happening here. Long before the rise of the Aksumite Empire, this site already displays architectural discipline that feels complete rather than experimental. The temple is rectangular, solid, and restrained. Its walls are built from massive ashlar blocks, stone cut into precise shapes and fitted together so tightly that no mortar was required. The joints are so exact that even today a blade cannot be inserted between many of the stones. This level of precision is not decorative, it is structural. Ashlar masonry demands accuracy from the first cut to the final placement. A single poorly shaped block disrupts load transfer across the wall. At Yeha, the walls behave as unified masses, distributing weight evenly from top to base. The stones were quarried, shaped, transported, and placed with consistency across the entire structure. This implies standardized methods, shared measurement systems, and skilled labor operating under clear oversight. This was not improvisation. The temple walls are thick, far thicker than required for height alone. This thickness creates thermal stability, structural redundancy, and resistance to seismic movement. In a region subject to temperature variation and ground motion, these choices matter. The building does not flex easily, it absorbs stress. The exterior surfaces are smooth and controlled. There is no surface carving, no relief work, no visual storytelling. Meaning was not placed on the walls. Meaning was placed in their permanence. The interior, now largely ruined, was once roofed and enclosed, forming a space that would have felt heavy and quiet. Light would have entered deliberately, not freely. This controlled illumination reinforces the idea that this was a space meant for focused ritual rather than public gathering. The orientation of the temple aligns with broader regional traditions, linking architecture to cosmology and landscape rather than urban planning. Yeha was not embedded in a dense city. It stood slightly apart, elevated in meaning rather than in height. Its placement suggests visibility without dominance. One of the most revealing aspects of the Great Temple is how little it has moved. Over nearly 3,000 years, the walls remain upright, aligned, and stable despite the loss of roof elements and later reuse of nearby structures. This stability is not accidental. The foundation work beneath the temple is broad and deliberate, spreading the load of the massive stone walls across prepared ground. The builders anticipated settlement and compensated for it through mass rather than flexibility. This choice reflects confidence in material behavior. Unlike later masonry traditions that rely on mortar to correct minor errors, Yeha's builders had no such margin. Precision was mandatory. Once stones were placed, correction was nearly impossible. They still placed them correctly. The temple also reveals cultural connections that extend beyond Ethiopia. The masonry style, proportions, and inscriptions suggest contact with South Arabian traditions, particularly those of ancient Saba. But Yeha is not a copy. It is adaptation. The builders took external ideas and applied them to local conditions, materials, and climate. The stone itself comes from nearby sources. The techniques were adjusted to suit the geology of the Ethiopian highlands. This hybridization shows agency, not imitation. What makes Yeha especially important in a series examining ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions is how complete its architectural logic already is at such an early date. There is no visible learning curve here, no crude earlier phase beneath refined construction. The building appears fully realized. This challenges the idea that monumental stone architecture in Africa emerged suddenly or late. Yeha demonstrates that complex planning, skilled masonry, and long-term architectural thinking were already present and functioning independently. Standing near the temple today, the experience is subdued. The walls do not overwhelm. They ground you. The stone absorbs sound. The space feels steady rather than dramatic. This steadiness is intentional. The temple was not meant to impress travelers with spectacle. It was meant to anchor belief, authority, and continuity in a landscape that values endurance over display. Later civilizations recognized this strength. Elements from Yeha were reused in subsequent constructions nearby, not because the temple failed, but because its stones remained valuable centuries later. Stone that lasts becomes resource. The Great Temple of Yeha does not rely on mystery to command attention. It relies on competence. Every visible decision points to builders who understood how stone behaves under load, how walls age, and how structures interact with ground over long periods. They built with time in mind. In modern discussions of ancient architecture, Yeha is often overshadowed by larger or more ornate sites, but its restraint is precisely why it matters. It shows what happens when architecture is stripped of excess and focused entirely on durability and purpose. No ornament to weather away, no mortar to fail, no unnecessary height to destabilize, just stone placed exactly where it needed to be. The temple remains because it never asked the material to do more than it could. It was not a test of ambition, it was an application of understanding. In a world where many ancient structures survive only as fragments, Yeha stands as a reminder that permanence does not require scale or decoration. It requires judgment. Judgment in choosing stone, judgment in cutting it, judgment in placing it. The great temple of Yeha is not an unanswered question carved in stone. It is an answer that has been standing quietly for nearly 3,000 years. An answer that says ancient builders here were not experimenting in the dark. They knew exactly what they were doing. And because of that, their work remains calm, intact, and unyielding, long after the world around it changed. Uplistsikhe. On a sandstone plateau overlooking the slow curve of the Kura River in eastern Georgia, there is a city that was never built upward and never assembled piece by piece. It was removed from the land instead, carved patiently out of living rock until streets, halls, chambers, and sanctuaries emerged where solid stone once stood. This is Uplistsikhe. Unlike most ancient cities, Uplistsikhe does not announce itself with walls or towers visible from afar. From a distance, it blends into the cliff, its entrances hidden by shadow and erosion. Only when you step onto the plateau does the scale reveal itself, an entire urban system hollowed directly into stone. Uplistsikhe was not a cave site in the domestic sense. It was a fully functioning city, occupied continuously for more than 1,000 years, from the early Iron Age through the medieval period. It contained ceremonial halls, storage rooms, wine presses, drainage systems, streets, defensive corridors, and places of authority, and all of it was carved. This choice alone defines the intelligence of the site. Carving an entire city into rock commits you to permanence. You cannot rebuild easily. You cannot shift streets. You cannot correct large errors. Once space is removed, it is gone forever. The builders of Uplistsikhe accepted this risk. The rock itself is sandstone, softer than granite, harder than soil, workable but unforgiving if mishandled. It erodes slowly, fractures unpredictably, and demands careful planning to avoid collapse. Every chamber carved into it alters the stress distribution of the plateau. This meant that urban planning and structural engineering could not be separated. The city's layout reflects this constraint clearly. Major halls are spaced deliberately apart, leaving thick rock masses between them to carry load. Roof spans are conservative. Pillars are left standing not as decoration, but as structural necessity. Ceilings follow natural curves rather than flat, planes, reducing stress concentration. Nothing here is excessive. Movement through the city follows carved channels and stairways that guide people naturally along stable routes. Narrow passages widen gradually. Sharp turns are avoided where possible. This reduces fracture risk and allows the stone to age without catastrophic failure. Even streets were engineered. They slope gently, channeling rainwater away from occupied spaces and toward carved drainage paths that exit the plateau. Water was not allowed to collect inside the city. In sandstone, standing water destroys integrity. The builders prevented that. One of the most remarkable aspects of Uplistsikhe is its zoning. Ritual spaces occupy the highest, most stable areas of the plateau. Storage and production areas sit lower, closer to access routes and drainage. Living spaces are distributed in between. This vertical logic mirrors the natural strength of the rock. Heavy use areas were placed where stone could carry stress. Lighter functions occupied more vulnerable zones. This is urban planning guided by geology rather than aesthetics. Wine production played a central role here. Large rock-cut presses and storage vats were carved directly into the plateau, some of them enormous. Fermentation requires stable temperature, cleanliness, and containment. Rock provided all three. These installations were not temporary. They were city-scale infrastructure. The presence of extensive wine production suggests not only ritual importance, but economic organization. Uplist was not isolated. It was connected to trade routes moving through the Kura Valley, serving as a node of exchange, authority, and storage. A city carved into stone is not built for abandonment. It is built for control. Defensive considerations were integrated subtly rather than overtly. Narrow access points funnel movement. Elevated positions provide visibility. Certain corridors could be blocked easily without walls or gates. The city defends itself by geometry. Later additions, including Christian churches carved into the rock, reused existing spaces rather than disrupting the city's core structure. This reuse indicates that even centuries later, the original carving logic was still respected. New belief systems adapted to old stone. Earthquakes eventually damaged parts of Uplist, particularly in the medieval period. Large sections collapsed where the rock had been overworked, or where later modifications weakened load-bearing zones. But the majority of the city remains. This survival is revealing. The failures show exactly where the limits were crossed. The intact sections show where the original builders stayed within them. The contrast confirms that the earliest phases of carving were the most disciplined. Standing inside Uplist today, the experience is not that of ruin, but of exposure. You see layers of decision-making in the walls themselves. Tool marks reveal direction, pillars reveal restraint. Empty spaces reveal what was intentionally left uncarved. Silence behaves differently here. Sound is absorbed by stone. Wind moves through corridors unpredictably. The city feels porous, not enclosed. This openness reflects a different idea of urban life, one that does not separate inside from outside sharply, but transitions gradually between them. Uplist also challenges the idea that cities must be built from accumulated material. Here, complexity emerged through subtraction. Planning required imagining negative space before it existed. This demands abstract thinking. You must see rooms before carving them, streets before walking them, load paths before testing them. The builders visualized the city fully before removing the first stone. That level of foresight is rare even in later architecture. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Uplist stands as one of the clearest examples of prehistoric urban intelligence. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is systematic. There are no impossible stones here. There are only correct decisions repeated consistently. The city does not rely on ornament to define importance. Authority was expressed through placement, scale, and control of access rather than decoration. Power here was spatial, not visual. This spatial power endured long after political power shifted. When the city was eventually abandoned, it was not because the architecture failed. It was because trade routes moved, political centers changed, and priorities shifted. The stone itself remained capable. Uplist was left behind intact. That distinction matters. Standing on the plateau today, looking down at the river below, it becomes clear why this place was chosen. The land offers visibility, control, and natural defense. The stone offers permanence. The river offers connection. Everything aligns. The builders did not impose a city onto the landscape. They extracted one from it. And in doing so, they created a place where architecture, geology, and social organization became inseparable. Uplist does not ask us to imagine forgotten technologies or lost civilizations. It asks us to recognize planning at a scale that does not rely on machines or spectacle. It relies on patience, on knowing when to carve and when to stop. The rock-cut stone city of Uplist remains because it was never fragile. It was not stacked. It was not balanced. It was not assembled from vulnerable parts. It was shaped from the land itself. And because of that, even after centuries of abandonment, erosion, and collapse, the city still exists. Open to the sky, carved into the plateau, continuing to reveal how much ancient builders understood about stone, space, and time. Not by what they added, but by what they chose to remove. Talaiotic Navetas. On the island of Minorca, where the Mediterranean light feels unusually sharp and the land rolls gently without dramatic extremes, there are stone structures that look unlike anything else in prehistoric Europe. They do not rise high. They do not dominate the skyline. And yet, they are among the most carefully reasoned constructions of the ancient world. These are the Talaiotic Navetas. At first glance, a naveta appears simple. A long, low structure built entirely from stone, shaped vaguely like an overturned boat. There are no carvings, no inscriptions, no decorative flourishes. But the longer you look, the clearer it becomes that every aspect of the naveta's form is the result of deliberate choice rather than tradition or symbolism alone. Navetas are among the earliest freestanding stone buildings in Europe, dating back more than 3,000 years. They were built by the Talaiotic culture, a society that left no written language but expressed its understanding of stone, space, and death through architecture that has proven remarkably durable. The most famous example, Naveta des Tudons, has survived almost entirely intact. That survival is not accidental. The naveta is constructed using large limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. This dry stone technique relies entirely on gravity, friction, and careful placement. The stones are stacked so that weight is directed inward and downward, locking the structure together as mass increases. The walls are thick, far thicker than required for height alone. This thickness stabilizes the structure, regulates temperature, and provides redundancy. If one stone shifts slightly over time, others compensate. This is architecture designed to tolerate movement. The naveta's exterior slopes inward gently as it rises. This tapering reduces outward pressure and makes collapse far less likely. Sharp corners are avoided. Stress is dispersed gradually rather than concentrated. The shape is not symbolic first. It is structural first. Inside, the naveta contains two chambers arranged vertically. The lower chamber was used for burial. The upper chamber, accessed through a separate opening, likely served ritual or preparatory functions. This vertical organization shows clear planning. Different activities were separated without requiring additional structures. Space was managed efficiently. The interior chambers are enclosed, dark, and stable. Temperature changes slowly. Moisture is limited. These conditions are ideal for preserving remains, which explains why navetas were reused repeatedly over long periods rather than sealed after a single event. The dead were not isolated from the living landscape. They were integrated into it. The placement of navetas across Minorca also reveals intention. They are not hidden. They sit visibly in the landscape, often near settlements, but not within them. This positioning allowed memory without intrusion, presence, without occupation. The naveta was meant to be returned to. Structurally, the builder showed deep understanding of limestone behavior. Limestone weathers on the surface but remains strong in mass. The builders exploited this by using large blocks externally and carefully fitting smaller stones internally to fill voids and stabilize joints. Nothing here is random. Every stone has a job. The roof of the naveta is not a separate element. It is formed by overlapping stone courses that gradually close inward, creating a core-belt vault. This technique eliminates the need for long-spanning stones, which would be vulnerable to fracture. Corbelling turns gravity into support. As weight increases above, the stones press more tightly together, strengthening the structure rather than weakening it. This is why navetas remain intact while many later mortared buildings collapsed. Mortar fails. Geometry endures. The navetas also revealed social organization. Building one required coordination, shared labor, and long-term planning. These were not household projects. They were communal investments in continuity. You do not build a structure like this unless you expect your community to remain. The absence of ornamentation is striking. There is no attempt to tell stories in stone, no visual hierarchy, no named individual honored above others. The structure itself carries meaning through effort and permanence. Equality is embedded into form. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Talaiotic Nevedas matter because they show how advanced architectural thinking does not require complexity of appearance. Intelligence is expressed through restraint, repetition, and refusal to overbuild. These structures were not pushing material limits. They were staying safely within them. Standing beside a Nevada today, the experience is calm. The stone absorbs sound. The walls feel thick and protective. The structure does not invite exploration aggressively. It asks for patience. You feel the time invested here. What is most revealing is that Nevedas were not replaced quickly by new burial forms. They remained relevant for centuries. This suggests that their design solved the problem effectively enough that change was unnecessary. That is rare in architecture. The Talaiotic builders understood that stone structures succeed not by resisting time, but by cooperating with it. Weather softens edges but does not destabilize form. Minor shifts tighten joints rather than opening them. Failure was anticipated and minimized. Nevedas also challenged the assumption that prehistoric societies prioritized spectacle in death. Here, death is managed quietly. The architecture does not glorify individuals. It stabilizes memory. Stone becomes continuity. Even after the Talaiotic culture disappeared, the Nevetas remained. Later, people did not dismantle them for material. They respected them as fixed elements of the land. That respect likely came from recognition that these structures were difficult to improve upon. The Talaiotic Nevedas do not ask us to imagine lost machines or forgotten tools. They ask us to recognize that ancient builders understood material behavior deeply enough to create structures that simply do not need explanation. They work. They remain. They continue to do what they were built to do: hold space, regulate environment, and endure. In the end, the Nevedas are not mysterious because we lack answers. They are challenging because the answers are so clear. Stone placed carefully, form chosen wisely, limits respected. The Talaiotic Nevetas stand today not as relics of a primitive past, but as evidence of a society that understood one essential truth very early on: that if you build something exactly as strong as it needs to be, and no stronger, it may last longer than anything built to impress. And as the Mediterranean wind moves across Menorca's fields, these quiet stone vessels remain grounded, unmoved, still carrying the weight they were designed to carry, not upward, but through time. Motila del Azuer. In the flat plains of La Mancha, where the land stretches outward with little variation and surface water disappears for long periods of the year, there is a prehistoric structure that looks, at first, strangely out of place. It rises gently rather than dramatically, built not on a hill or cliff, but in open terrain where nothing appears to need defending. This is Motila del Azuer. What makes this site extraordinary is not its visibility, but its purpose. Motila del Azuer is not a fortress in the traditional sense, and it is not a ceremonial monument. It is something far more specific and far more revealing. It is a machine for accessing water. Dating to the Bronze Age, roughly the 2nd millennium BCE, Motila del Azuer was constructed during a period of extreme environmental stress. Paleoclimate evidence indicates prolonged drought conditions across the Iberian Peninsula. Rivers dried seasonally. Surface wells failed. Rainfall became unreliable. In this environment, survival depended not on conquest, but on control of groundwater. The Motila is built around a deep central well, excavated down to the water table and lined with stone to prevent collapse. This well is the oldest known example of a fortified groundwater system in Western Europe. Everything else at the site exists to protect it. Surrounding the well are multiple concentric stone walls, forming a compact, inward-focused structure. These walls are thick, carefully built, and terraced, creating an enclosed core that feels dense rather than tall. This inward density is the key. The builders were not trying to dominate the landscape. They were trying to secure access to something invisible beneath it. The central well descends several meters below ground level, reaching stable groundwater even during severe drought. Excavating such a well with Bronze Age tools required patience, planning, and geological understanding. Dig too shallow and the water fails. Dig too deep and the walls collapse. The builders found the balance. The stone lining of the well is disciplined and consistent, preventing erosion while allowing water to rise naturally. This lining had to be maintained carefully. Any failure would contaminate or block access to the most valuable resource in the region. The concentric walls surrounding the well serve multiple functions. Structurally, they stabilize the central excavation by distributing pressure outward. Socially, they control access. Defensively, they discourage seizure during times of scarcity. This is architecture responding directly to crisis. Unlike later fortifications built to repel armies, Motilla de l'Azuer was built to regulate people, who could enter, who could draw water, when access was allowed. The walls create thresholds rather than battlements. Movement inward becomes progressively restricted. The outer areas of the Motilla include storage spaces, working platforms, and living areas. These are modest, functional spaces designed to support the operation of the central system. Nothing here distracts from the primary purpose. Water first, everything else second. The walls are constructed using stone and earth, layered carefully to absorb stress and prevent collapse. Their circular arrangement distributes force evenly, minimizing weak points. Sharp angles are avoided. Height is limited to reduce instability. This design reflects understanding of soil behavior. In flat terrain with soft substrate, tall walls fail. Broad, thick walls endure. The builders chose endurance. Motilla de l'Azuer also reveals collective organization. Excavating and maintaining a deep well is not a short-term effort. It requires labor coordination, ongoing maintenance, and shared rules. This was not a private structure, it was communal infrastructure. The presence of storage areas suggests that water access was paired with food management. During drought, both had to be controlled together. The Motilla likely functioned as a regional hub, a place people returned to when surrounding conditions became unlivable. This explains its unusual placement. The Motilla is not located near rivers or fertile land because those resources were unreliable. It is located where groundwater could be reached consistently. The landscape dictated the solution. Archaeological evidence shows that Motilla de l'Azuer was used over generations. Repairs were made. Walls were reinforced. The well was kept functional. This continuity indicates that the system worked. If it had failed, it would have been abandoned. Instead, it became more important over time. Standing inside the structure today, the feeling is not of defense, but of concentration. Everything draws inward. Sightlines shorten. The space becomes focused. The well sits at the center, quiet and essential. This spatial compression is intentional. It reinforces the value of what lies below. Motilla de l'Azuer challenges a common assumption about prehistoric societies, that they reacted to environmental change passively. This site shows the opposite. It shows proactive adaptation through engineering. The builders did not migrate immediately. They dug. They invested effort into permanence in the face of uncertainty. They chose infrastructure over mobility, control over chance. This choice required confidence in knowledge. The Motilla also forces a re-evaluation of what counts as advanced architecture. There are no grand facades here, no decoration, no inscriptions. And yet, the system integrates geology, hydrology, structural engineering, and social regulation seamlessly. This is complexity expressed quietly. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern expectations, Motilla del Azuer stands apart because it represents an early example of environmental engineering at a community scale. It shows that ancient people did not simply endure climate stress. They engineered responses to it. The fact that this system predates Roman aqueducts and medieval wells by millennia makes it especially significant. It suggests that groundwater management emerged independently wherever survival demanded it. Knowledge followed necessity. The eventual abandonment of Motilla del Azuer was not due to structural failure. It coincided with climatic improvement and social change. When surface water returned and settlement patterns shifted, The intense focus on a single well was no longer required. The structure had done its job. That is perhaps its most telling feature. Motilla del Azuer was not meant to last forever as a monument. It was meant to function for as long as conditions required. That it still stands today is a byproduct of correct design, not intention to impress the future. The stone walls remain because they were built conservatively. The well remains because it was protected. The layout remains legible because it was never cluttered with excess. Everything here served a purpose. Motilla del Azuer does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or unknown machines. It asks us to recognize something more grounded, that prehistoric communities were capable of diagnosing environmental problems and applying engineering solutions with clarity and discipline. They understood water tables. They understood soil stability. They understood that survival could be planned. In a dry landscape where uncertainty ruled, they built certainty into the ground itself. And as the plains of La Mancha continue to shift between wet and dry cycles, the Motilla remains. A quiet reminder that long before modern hydrology, people were already listening carefully to the land beneath their feet and shaping stone not for power or display, but for continuity. A structure not built to conquer space, but to reach downward and hold life there. Dungar Stone House. On the northern Ethiopian plateau, not far from the monumental stele fields of Aksum, there is a large stone structure that rarely draws the same attention as the towering monuments nearby. It does not rise dramatically. It does not announce power through height. What remains today appears low, fragmented, and incomplete. And yet, this site reveals something far more intimate than monuments ever could. This is the Dungar Stone House. Often described as a palace or elite residence from the Aksumite period, Dungar is not important because of what it displays, but because of how it was organized. It represents a moment when architecture shifted from symbolic dominance to controlled domestic complexity, a stone-built environment designed to manage daily life, movement, water, and authority within a single enclosed system. Unlike rock-cut cities or massive fortifications, Dungar was assembled block by block. Its walls were built from carefully dressed stone, laid in horizontal courses, bonded with precision and intention. The stones are consistent in size and placement, suggesting standardized construction methods rather than ad hoc building. This consistency is not decorative, it is logistical. Dungar's plan is rectilinear, with clearly defined rooms arranged around central spaces. Corridors guide movement deliberately. Entrances are controlled rather than open. The layout suggests separation of function: public reception, private residence, storage, and service areas, all within a single architectural framework. This kind of spatial planning does not emerge accidentally. It reflects social hierarchy expressed through space rather than scale. One of the most revealing aspects of the Dungar Stonehouse is its water management system. Channels carved into stone floors and foundations guide rainwater away from living areas, preventing pooling and structural damage. In a region with seasonal rainfall, uncontrolled water is one of the fastest ways to destroy stone architecture. The builders anticipated this. Drainage was not added later. It was integrated from the beginning. Floors slope subtly. Thresholds are raised. Water exits the structure efficiently without undermining walls or foundations. This level of planning suggests long-term occupation rather than ceremonial use. Dungar was meant to be lived in. The walls of the structure are thick, but not excessive. Their thickness provides thermal stability, keeping interiors cooler during the day and warmer at night. This passive climate control is achieved entirely through mass and layout, without reliance on height or ornament. Windows were likely limited and carefully positioned. Light entered where it was useful, not where it weakened walls. Airflow was controlled rather than unrestricted. Comfort here is managed quietly. Archaeological evidence indicates that the structure once included multiple stories, supported by stone foundations capable of carrying vertical load. The fact that the lower levels remain stable suggests that the builders understood load distribution well enough to plan upward expansion without risking collapse. This understanding did not come from experimentation, it came from tradition. The Dungar stone house is often compared to structures in South Arabia, reflecting Axum's trade connections across the Red Sea. But like other Aksumite architecture, Dungar is not an imitation. It adapts external influences to local materials, climate, and social needs. Stone used here comes from nearby sources. Its behavior under stress, moisture, and temperature was well understood. The builders did not push it to extremes. They allowed margin for settlement, weathering, and repair. This margin is why the foundations remain readable today. Inside the structure, rooms vary in size and proportion, indicating different uses rather than uniform design. Some spaces are large and open, suitable for gatherings or reception. Others are narrow and controlled, likely private or administrative. Movement through the building would have reinforced social boundaries without the need for explicit barriers. Architecture here performs authority silently. Dungar also reveals something often overlooked in discussions of ancient engineering: maintenance. This structure was not built to be abandoned quickly. Its materials, layout, and drainage suggest expectation of upkeep, repair, and reuse. Stone buildings invite maintenance only when they are worth maintaining. Dungar was. The later history of the site shows reuse and modification, but not wholesale dismantling. Stones were valuable. Foundations were respected. Even as the political center of Aksum declined, the structure was not erased entirely. Its logic remained legible. Standing within the remains today, the experience is grounded rather than monumental. Walls define space without overwhelming it. The layout feels deliberate, but not rigid. The structure invites interpretation through movement rather than spectacle. This quality is important. Dungar was not meant to be seen from afar. It was meant to function. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Dungar Stonehouse matters because it demonstrates a different kind of sophistication, one focused on domestic engineering, not ritual display or defensive excess. It shows that ancient societies invested serious planning effort into how people lived, moved, and interacted within stone-built environments. This kind of architecture leaves fewer dramatic ruins, but it leaves clearer evidence of intelligence. The builders of Dungar understood that permanence does not require monumentality. It requires adaptability, drainage, proportion, and restraint. These qualities do not photograph well. They endure quietly. That quiet endurance is what makes Dungar important. It stands as evidence that Aksumite engineering was not limited to stelae and temples. It extended into daily life, shaping spaces that balanced authority with habitability. Stone here was not used to intimidate. It was used to organize. And because of that, the structure continues to reveal its logic even in ruin. Walls still align. Rooms still make sense. Drainage still works where it remains intact. Nothing here feels accidental. The Dungar Stonehouse does not force us to imagine lost technologies or unknown builders. It invites us to recognize something more grounded: that ancient people understood how to create complex living environments using stone alone, without excess, without waste, and without spectacle. They planned for rain. They planned for movement. And in doing so, they created a structure that still speaks clearly, not through size or mystery, but through competence. As the Ethiopian plateau continues to weather under sun and seasonal rain, the foundations of Dungar remain where they were set, holding shape, holding logic, and quietly reminding us that some of the most advanced ancient architecture was not built to be remembered. It was built to be lived in. And because it served that purpose well, it remains fragmentary, understated, and precise, long after the lives it once sheltered have passed into history. Cadbury Castle. On a limestone hill rising gently above the plains of Somerset, there is a place where the land itself seems to have been shaped into defence. From a distance, Cadbury Castle looks natural, a rounded hill with soft contours and broad slopes. Nothing about it feels abrupt or engineered. And yet, nearly everything you see is the result of deliberate human decision. This is Cadbury Castle. Unlike stone-built fortresses or walled cities, Cadbury Castle is defined primarily by earth. Its strength comes from layered banks, deep ditches, and repeated lines of enclosure that wrap the hilltop like accumulated memory. It is one of the most complex and long-lived hill forts in Britain, not because it was rebuilt once, but because it was reshaped again and again across centuries. This was not a single project. It was an ongoing conversation with the landscape. The earliest activity here dates back to the Neolithic period, long before the fortifications that define the site today. Later, during the Iron Age, Cadbury Castle was transformed into a massive defensive enclosure, covering more than 18 acres at its peak. The scale is important. This was not a refuge for a few families. It was a regional centre, a place of gathering, control, storage, and authority. And it achieved all of this without relying on stone walls or monumental architecture. Instead, it relied on geometry and mass. The ramparts of Cadbury Castle are built in multiple concentric lines, each consisting of a raised earthen bank paired with a deep ditch. The soil removed from the ditch was piled inward to form the bank, creating a structure that grows stronger as material accumulates. This is not excavation waste. It is structural material. Each line of defense forces movement into controlled paths. Attackers must descend into a ditch, climb a steep bank under exposure, and repeat the process multiple times. This layered resistance exhausts momentum long before the summit is reached. Defense here is cumulative. The builders understood that height alone is less effective than repeated effort. Cadbury Castle does not rely on a single dramatic wall. It relies on persistence. The slopes of the ramparts are carefully angled. Too steep, and erosion accelerates. Too shallow, and climbing becomes easy. The angles chosen slow water runoff while still resisting ascent. This balance is critical in Britain's wet climate. Poorly shaped earthworks fail quickly. These did not. The ramparts were faced in places with stone revetments, not to create walls, but to stabilize vulnerable sections. Stone was used selectively, only where earth alone was insufficient. This reveals an understanding of material hierarchy rather than aesthetic preference. Earth where mass matters, stone where erosion threatens. Inside the fort, the plateau is broad and gently sloped. Archaeological evidence shows roundhouses, storage pits, and working areas spread across the interior. This was not an empty stronghold waiting for attack. It was a lived-in place. Food was stored here. Animals were kept here. People gathered, traded, and made decisions here. The fort's size allowed it to function as a social and economic centre, not just a military one. This matters because it explains why Cadbury Castle was maintained. Earthworks require upkeep, ditches fill, banks slump. Without continued investment, a hill fort erodes back into a hill. The fact that Cadbury Castle's defences were expanded and reinforced over time tells us that the site remained valuable. Value justified labour. Entrances to the fort were not simple gaps. They were complex, funnel-shaped approaches that forced slow, predictable movement. Pathways curve. Sightlines are restricted. Defenders could observe anyone entering long before they reached the interior. Architecture here controls behaviour. This control extends beyond defence. Movement inside the fort follows the shape of the land rather than imposing rigid order. Paths adapt to slopes. Structures sit where drainage allows. Water is guided naturally toward lower ground. Once again, the builders worked with terrain rather than against it. Cadbury Castle's location is also revealing. It sits at a junction of routes connecting different parts of southern Britain. From the summit, views extend across the surrounding countryside, allowing early warning and communication. Visibility here is strategic, not symbolic. The hill fort also carries layers of later history. Roman occupation left traces. Post-Roman activity followed. Medieval folklore later linked the site to Camelot, reflecting how deeply it remained embedded in cultural memory. These later associations do not explain the fort. They confirm its presence. People returned here repeatedly because the site continued to offer what it always had: security, visibility, and control rooted in the land itself. From a structural perspective, Cadbury Castle is an example of architecture that anticipates decay and accommodates it. Earth settles, banks slump, ditches soften. The design allows for this without catastrophic failure. Maintenance here meant reshaping, not rebuilding. This is resilience by acceptance. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Cadbury Castle matters because it shows that large-scale engineering does not require stone or metal to be effective. Knowledge of soil behavior, water flow, and human movement was enough. The builders understood that Earth is not weak. It is patient. When shaped correctly, it absorbs time rather than fighting it. Erosion becomes gradual. Collapse becomes unlikely. The structure ages rather than fails. Standing on the ramparts today, the scale is felt more than seen. The lines of defense stretch outward, overlapping and merging with the landscape. It becomes difficult to tell where construction ends and terrain begins. This ambiguity is the fort's greatest strength. An enemy cannot easily read the structure. Nature cannot easily dismantle it. Time cannot easily erase it. Cadbury Castle also challenges the idea that ancient power was always expressed vertically. Here, power spreads horizontally, through control of space rather than dominance of skyline. No towers announce authority. The land itself does. The fort's eventual decline was not due to structural inadequacy. It followed changes in political organization, warfare, and settlement patterns. When centralized hilltop centers were no longer needed, maintenance ceased. The earthworks did not collapse. They simply softened. That softness is why they remain legible today. Cadbury Castle does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten machines. It asks us to recognize a different kind of intelligence, one rooted in observation, repetition, and long-term thinking. The builders understood soil. They understood slope. They understood that defense begins before the first blow is struck. By shaping the hill rather than building upon it, they created a structure that could survive centuries of change without requiring constant repair. In that sense, Cadbury Castle is not a monument. It is a method of turning land into architecture, movement into defense, and time into reinforcement. And as wind and rain continue to pass over the Somerset Hills, the ramparts remain, not sharp, not imposing, but present, still outlining the decisions made by people who understood that the strongest structures are often the ones that disappear most completely into the ground they depend on. Not built against the land, but built as part of it. Los Millares. In the dry hills of southeastern Spain, above the Andarax River Valley, there is a prehistoric settlement that does not rely on a single wall, a single monument, or a single explanation. Instead, it presents a layered system of decisions, defensive, social, and environmental, that together form one of the earliest fully fortified communities in Western Europe. This is Los Millares. At first glance, the site feels complex rather than impressive. Low stone walls trace irregular lines across the terrain. Circular towers interrupt pathways. Beyond the settlement core, dozens of stone-built tombs spread across the surrounding hills. Nothing here dominates the horizon. And yet, when viewed as a system rather than as individual structures, Los Millares becomes unmistakably deliberate. The settlement dates to the Copper Age, roughly the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BCE, a time when metal use was emerging but stone, earth, and planning still carried most of the architectural burden. Los Millares was not a village that slowly became fortified. It was founded fortified. The central settlement sits on a spur overlooking the valley, naturally defended on several sides by steep slopes. But natural advantage was not considered sufficient. The builders added multiple concentric stone walls, each reinforced with bastions and towers, creating layered zones of access and control. Defense here is progressive. An approach to Los Millares would not involve breaching a single barrier. It would involve navigating a sequence of enclosed spaces, each narrowing movement and exposing entrance to observation. This slows momentum, limits numbers, and increases vulnerability without relying on height or spectacle. The walls themselves are modest in height, but substantial in thickness. Built from local stone laid without mortar, they rely on mass and geometry rather than precision cutting. Corners are rounded. Transitions are gradual. Stress is distributed rather than concentrated. These choices reduce failure. The towers integrated into the walls are not decorative. They project outward just enough to extend visibility and control approach angles. Their placement follows terrain rather than symmetry, indicating adaptation rather than formula. Los Millares was not copied from a template. It was shaped by the land it occupied. Inside the walls, the settlement shows signs of dense occupation. Houses cluster together, forming compact neighborhoods rather than dispersed dwellings. This density reduces exposed perimeter and strengthens collective defense. Movement inside the settlement is controlled but not rigid. Paths curve, sightlines shift. The layout discourages direct passage from one side to another, reinforcing internal security. Beyond the settlement walls lies one of the most revealing features of Los Millares, its cemetery. Dozens of tholos tombs, circular stone-built burial chambers with corbelled roofs, are scattered across the surrounding landscape. These tombs were not placed randomly. They form a buffer zone around the settlement, occupying the approaches and reinforcing territorial control symbolically as well as physically. Anyone approaching Los Millares would pass through the space of the dead before reaching the living. Architecture here shapes perception. The tombs themselves are carefully constructed. Corbelled vaults distribute weight inward and downward, allowing stone roofs without long spanning slabs. Entrances are narrow and controlled. Chambers are stable and reusable. These were collective burial spaces, used repeatedly over time. This reuse implies continuity and social memory. The dead were not removed from daily life. They remained part of the landscape that defined community boundaries. The relationship between settlement and cemetery suggests a society that understood space holistically. Defense, ritual, and identity were not separated into different zones. They overlapped intentionally. Los Millares also reveals early metallurgical activity. Evidence of copperworking has been found within the settlement, indicating specialized production. This specialization likely contributed to the need for defense. Resources attract attention. Fortification here is not paranoia. It is response. The builders of Los Millares anticipated conflict, competition, or pressure long before written history records it. They invested labor into protection not as a reaction to catastrophe, but as a condition of stability. This foresight matters. The settlement's walls were repaired, reinforced, and expanded over time. New defensive lines were added outward rather than replacing earlier ones, creating depth rather than redundancy. Each generation respected the logic of the previous one. That respect suggests shared understanding. Water management is subtle but present. The settlement's position allows runoff to move away naturally. Surfaces are angled. Storage areas are protected from flooding. In an arid region, even small miscalculations matter. Los Millares survived because it did not waste effort. What makes the site especially important in a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions is how early it appears in the archaeological record. This level of defensive planning is often associated with later urban societies. Here, it appears at the threshold of metallurgy. This suggests that social complexity, planning, and long-term thinking did not wait for advanced technology. They emerged as soon as conditions required them. Standing among the ruins today, the site feels quiet and expansive. Walls no longer rise high. Towers no longer command views. But the layout remains legible. You can still trace how movement was guided, how access was filtered, how space was controlled. That legibility is proof of coherence. Los Millares does not rely on mystery to remain compelling. It relies on clarity. Each element serves a function. Each function supports the whole. There is no excess. The settlement did not attempt to intimidate through monumentality. It discouraged intrusion through persistence. Layer after layer of small obstacles adds up to a formidable system. This is defense through patience. The eventual abandonment of Los Millares was not due to structural failure. Climate shifts, social change, and evolving networks altered the conditions that made the site viable. When those conditions disappeared, the settlement was left behind. The walls did not collapse immediately. They endured. That endurance is the final lesson of Los Millares. It shows that ancient communities were capable of designing systems that balanced effort, risk, and reward with remarkable precision. They did not build blindly. They did not overbuild. They did not trust chance. They observed their environment, anticipated pressure, and shaped stone and space accordingly. Los Millares stands today not as a single monument, but as an argument that organized defense, spatial planning, and collective memory were already fully present thousands of years before classical cities appeared. An argument written not in text, but in walls that still trace the logic of people who understood that survival depends less on strength than on structure. And as the dry wind continues to move across the Andalusian hills, the outlines of Los Millares remain, quietly preserving the evidence that long before history named its first civilizations, people here were already thinking like engineers, planners, and strategists, not reacting to the future, preparing for it. Olmec colossal heads. In the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where rivers shift course slowly and dense vegetation reclaims almost everything left unattended, there are stone monuments that do not belong to temples, tombs, or cities in the usual sense. They stand alone, carved from single blocks of basalt, weighing up to 50 tons. These massive human faces emerge from the earth with an unsettling calm. They are not elevated. They are not framed. They do not demand attention through height or decoration. They simply exist. These are the Olmec colossal heads. What makes these sculptures extraordinary is not only their size, but the decisions required to make them possible at all. Each head was carved from a single basalt boulder quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, often transported over distances of more than 100 kilometers to sites like San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. There were no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, no metal tools. Every stage of the process, extraction, transport, carving, placement, required planning, coordination, and social organization at a scale rarely acknowledged for such an early civilization. The Olmec culture flourished between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, long before later Mesoamerican empires. This makes the existence of the colossal heads especially challenging to explain within simplified narratives of gradual technological progress. These sculptures do not look experimental. They look resolved. Basalt is an unforgiving material. It is extremely hard, resistant to fracture, and difficult to shape precisely even with modern tools. Carving detailed facial features into basalt using stone tools requires not brute force, but controlled repetition over long periods. Mistakes cannot be hidden. The faces are individualized. Each head has distinct features, different facial proportions, expressions, and headgear. This is not stylized repetition. It is portraiture. Someone was being remembered. The heads are often interpreted as representations of rulers or elite figures. Whether or not this is correct, what matters architecturally is that enormous effort was invested in creating objects that do not serve structural or defensive purposes. These stones do not hold walls. They do not support roofs. They do not channel water. Their function is symbolic, but their execution is technical. Transporting the basalt blocks required intimate knowledge of landscape. Rivers were likely used as transport corridors. Seasonal flooding may have been exploited deliberately. The terrain was not conquered, it was timed. This kind of logistics requires shared calendars, labor coordination, and long-term planning. You cannot move a 50-ton stone impulsively. You prepare for it months, possibly years in advance. The heads were then carved close to their final locations. Tool marks show controlled shaping rather than rough reduction. The surfaces are smoothed selectively, leaving evidence of labor rather than erasing it completely. This balance between refinement and rawness feels intentional. The placement of the heads is equally revealing. They were often arranged in lines or groups, sometimes reburied, moved, or repositioned over time. This suggests that their meaning was not fixed. They were interacted with, Some heads were deliberately buried, possibly ritually retired. Others were relocated and recontextualized. This reuse indicates that the stones were not static monuments, but participants in social life. Stone here is not final, it is active. From a structural perspective, the heads demonstrate understanding of mass and stability. Their bases are wide. Their centers of gravity are low. They are unlikely to topple accidentally, even on uneven ground. This matters in flood-prone environments. The Olmec did not raise the heads onto platforms unnecessarily. Elevation increases risk. Instead, they grounded them. The faces themselves carry a quiet authority. Eyes are half-lidded. Mouths are neutral or slightly downturned. There is no overt aggression, no theatrical expression. Power here is conveyed through presence, not posture. This restraint contrasts sharply with later monumental traditions that emphasize height and dominance. The Olmec chose weight over elevation. This choice reflects a different understanding of permanence. A tall structure invites collapse. A heavy one resists movement. In a region where wood rots, earth erodes, and vegetation overtakes quickly, the decision to invest meaning into stone is telling. The Olmec selected the one material that could outlast climate and time, and they used it sparingly. Only a small number of colossal heads exist. This scarcity suggests that they were not decorative elements or mass-produced symbols. Each one mattered. Each one justified the cost. The fact that the heads were carved from single stones rather than assembled pieces is crucial. Monolithic. Sculpture removes points of failure. There are no joints to weaken, no seams to separate. The entire object behaves as one. This decision aligns with the Olmec approach to architecture more broadly. Preference for solidity, grounding, and integration with landscape rather than vertical ambition. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Olmec colossal heads stand apart because they are neither buildings nor tools. They are expressions of authority executed with engineering discipline. They show that early societies could mobilize massive labor for reasons beyond survival. They also challenge the idea that symbolic art emerges after infrastructure. Here, symbolic stonework exists alongside early urban planning, not after it. The heads do not explain themselves. They do not tell stories. They do not glorify events. They present faces, calm, grounded, immovable. This ambiguity is part of their strength. They do not need interpretation to function. Their meaning lies in the fact that they exist at all. Standing before one today, the scale is immediate. The stone absorbs sound. The face feels less like an object and more like a presence. You become aware of your own movement, your own size. This effect was likely intentional. The Olmec understood that mass shapes perception. A face carved at this scale does not communicate through detail alone. It communicates through proportion relative to the human body. You do not dominate it, you meet it. The eventual decline of Olmec centers did not erase the heads. They were buried, damaged, moved, but not destroyed completely. Their survival is uneven, but persistent. Stone endured even as memory shifted. This endurance suggests that the Olmec were not carving for immediate recognition. They were carving into time itself, trusting that stone would carry presence forward, even if meaning changed. The colossal heads do not force us to imagine lost machines or unknown technologies. They force us to acknowledge coordination, patience, and material understanding at a scale that modern narratives often reserve for later civilizations. They are not evidence of mystery. They are evidence of competence. Competence applied to something that did not need to be practical, and that is precisely why it matters. The Olmec chose to spend enormous effort carving faces rather than walls or towers. In doing so, they revealed something essential about power in early societies. Power was not always vertical. It was not always enclosed. Sometimes it was simply present, heavy, unmoving, watching. As the rivers of the Gulf Coast continue to shift and the jungle continues to reclaim the land, these stone heads remain among the clearest signals that long before later empires rose. People here already understood how to command stone, labor, and meaning with quiet precision. Not to build upward, but to stay. And in staying, to remind us that some of the most enduring ancient structures were not shelters, not fortresses, and not temples, but faces carved into stone, placed deliberately in the world and left there to do what stone does best: endure. Sacsayhuaman. Above the city of Cusco, where the Andes rise sharply and the air thins into clarity, there is a stone complex that resists simple classification. It is often called a fortress, sometimes a ceremonial center, and occasionally a symbol carved into the body of the landscape itself. This is Sacsayhuaman. From a distance, the site reads as a series of massive zigzagging walls stepping across a hillside. As you approach, scale takes over. The stones grow larger, edges tighten, joints disappear. The walls feel less like construction and more like a rearrangement of geology. Sacsayhuaman was not built to be tall. It was built to be immovable. The most striking feature of the complex is its cyclopean masonry. Enormous limestone blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, are fitted together with precision so exact that seams nearly vanish. The stones are not rectangular. They are polygonal, shaped individually to interlock with their neighbors in 3 dimensions. This is not decoration, it is structural intelligence. Polygonal masonry distributes stress across multiple contact points, reducing the likelihood of cracking during seismic activity. In an earthquake-prone region like the Andes, this matters more than symmetry. Rectangular blocks fail along straight lines. Irregular blocks lock. Sacsayhuaman locks. The zigzag form of the walls is often interpreted symbolically, but it also serves a practical purpose. Each angle breaks the force of impact, whether from seismic waves or from potential attackers. Straight walls transmit energy efficiently. Angled walls dissipate it. Defense here is built into geometry. The walls are thick, several meters wide, and slightly inclined inward. This inward batter increases stability, lowering the center of gravity and helping the walls resist outward collapse. The stones grow larger toward the base, carrying load where it matters most. These decisions reflect careful planning rather than excess. The quarrying and transport of the stones present another layer of complexity. The limestone was sourced from nearby hills, but nearby in mountainous terrain still means significant elevation change. Moving blocks of this size without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools required coordination on a scale that is difficult to imagine without modern assumptions. Ramps, rollers, ropes, and human labor were likely used, but tools alone do not explain success. What mattered was organization, timing, leadership, and shared understanding of process. Sacsayhuaman was not built quickly. It was built deliberately. Once stones arrived at the site, they were shaped in place. Tool marks indicate repeated fitting and refitting, with stones lifted, adjusted, and lowered again until contact surfaces matched perfectly. This is slow work. It requires patience and skilled supervision. The result is not perfection for appearance's sake. It is perfection for endurance. The walls of Sacsayhuaman have survived major earthquakes that damaged or destroyed later colonial buildings in Cusco below. The stone does not crack easily. When movement occurs, the blocks shift minutely and settle back into place. Flexibility here is strength. Beyond the walls, the complex once included towers, terraces, water channels, and open spaces. Much of this upper architecture was dismantled after the Spanish conquest, its stones reused in Cusco. What remains today is the core, the part that was hardest to remove. That core was never decorative, it was foundational. The layout of Sacsayhuaman also reflects integration with the broader urban plan of Cusco. In Inca cosmology, the city was shaped like a puma, with Sacsayhuaman forming the head. Whether literal or symbolic, this relationship shows that the site was not isolated. It was part of a system. Water management reinforces this reading. Channels carved into stone guided rainwater away from walls and terraces, preventing erosion. Drainage here is subtle but continuous. The builders understood that water is as destructive as any enemy. They removed its advantage. The open spaces within the complex suggest ceremonial use alongside military readiness. Saksai Huaman was not a single-purpose installation. It could host gatherings, rituals, and administrative activity while remaining defensible. This dual function required balance. Overbuilding for defense would limit use. Overbuilding for ceremony would weaken protection. The builders chose proportion. The stones themselves show evidence of intentional shaping beyond simple fitting. Some blocks include knobs or protrusions, likely used for lifting and positioning. These were not removed after placement, suggesting that appearance was secondary to process. Function left its mark. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, Saksai Huaman matters because it reveals how advanced engineering can exist without written plans, metal tools, or centralized industrial production. The knowledge here was embodied, passed through practice, refined through repetition, executed through collective effort. The Inca did not rely on mortar to correct mistakes. They relied on precision to avoid them. This requires confidence, not just in technique, but in coordination across thousands of workers. Saksai Huaman also challenges the idea that monumental architecture must rise vertically to express power. Here, power spreads horizontally through mass and permanence. The walls do not tower, they endure. Standing beside them today, the stones feel calm. There is no sense of strain or imbalance. The structure does not look like it is fighting gravity. It cooperates with it. The eventual fall of the Inca Empire did not bring down Saksai Huaman. Human action dismantled parts of it, but the core remains because it was too difficult to destroy. This resistance is the final measure of its design. Saksai Huaman does not require mystery to be impressive. It does not need lost technologies or impossible tools to explain its existence. What it demonstrates is something more difficult to dismiss. That ancient builders understood stone deeply. That they understood earthquakes before seismology. That they understood organization before bureaucracy. They built something that could absorb time rather than resist it. As the Andes continue to shift slowly beneath Cusco, and as modern structures come and go, the walls of Saksai Huaman remain fixed where they were set, still following the contours of the hill, still locking into one another, still performing the task they were designed for. Not to rise higher, but to stay. Prehistoric sites of the Aksumite Kingdom. Long before the great stele of Aksum rose above the Ethiopian highlands, before inscriptions were carved and kings were named, the land was already marked by stone. Not monuments in the way we usually imagine them. Not palaces or temples meant to dominate the horizon, but platforms, foundations, terraces, and carefully prepared ground. Structures that suggest planning before power and engineering before empire. These are the prehistoric sites of the Aksumite Kingdom. They do not belong to a single moment in time. They represent a gradual accumulation of knowledge across centuries, possibly millennia, during which people learned how to work with basalt, granite, and limestone in a landscape shaped by tectonics, erosion, and seasonal extremes. What makes these sites significant is not what they display, but what they prepare for. Across northern Ethiopia and parts of modern Eritrea, archaeologists have identified stone-built foundations that predate classical Aksumite architecture. These structures often lack decoration, inscriptions, or overt symbolism. Instead, they emphasize alignment, stability, and repetition. They are architectural groundwork. Many of these early sites consist of leveled stone platforms, rectilinear foundations, and carefully laid walls that do not rise high but spread wide. The emphasis is horizontal rather than vertical. Load is distributed broadly across prepared ground rather than concentrated into towers or columns. This approach reflects deep familiarity with the land. The Ethiopian highlands are geologically complex. Volcanic rock dominates much of the region, interspersed with sedimentary layers that shift differently under stress. Building tall without understanding this behavior invites collapse. The early builders avoided that risk. Stone blocks were often cut with consistent proportions and laid in regular courses. Even in the absence of mortar, joints were tight. and surfaces controlled. This consistency suggests standardized methods rather than isolated experimentation. Someone was teaching this. Foundations at early Aksumite-related sites show clear concern for drainage. Channels were cut or formed to direct water away from structures. Floors were slightly inclined. Thresholds were raised. These details rarely survive in monumental ruins. But here, they are the architecture. This focus on water management is crucial. Seasonal rains in the highlands can be destructive. Stone structures fail not from weight alone, but from water undermining their base. The early builders understood this and built defensively against erosion rather than against enemies. Survival came first. What is striking is how these early sites anticipate later Aksumite architecture almost perfectly. The massive ashlar masonry of Yeha. The precise foundations beneath elite residences like Dungur. The stability of later monumental platforms. None of these appear suddenly. They rest on inherited knowledge. The prehistoric sites show early mastery of stone selection. Softer stone was used where shaping mattered. Harder stone where load-bearing mattered. Mixed materials were avoided unless necessary. This is not symbolic choice. It is engineering judgment. In several locations, early stone structures appear beneath later Aksumite buildings, reused rather than removed. This reuse suggests that the earlier work was respected, not seen as primitive or inferior, but as structurally sound. You do not reuse weak foundations. You reuse reliable ones. These early sites also suggest social organization before centralized kingship. Building stone platforms and foundations at this scale requires coordinated labor, shared planning, and long-term commitment. These were not temporary camps. They were places meant to last. This challenges the idea that the Aksumite kingdom emerged suddenly as a powerful trading empire. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a slow consolidation built on existing infrastructure, physical and social. Empire followed preparation. The prehistoric stone sites also reveal restraint. There is no evidence of excess ornamentation or monumental ambition at this stage. The builders did not push stone beyond safe limits. They worked conservatively, favoring repetition over novelty. This restraint is why so much survived. Standing among these early foundations today, the experience is subtle. There are no towering ruins to overwhelm you. Instead, the ground feels deliberate. Stone lines still guide movement. Platforms still define space. The land remembers the plan. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the prehistoric sites of the Aksumite kingdom matter because they reveal something often overlooked, that great civilizations are built first in silence, before monuments, before writing, before kings. They are built through decisions about stone, water, ground, and time. The Aksumites did not invent their architecture fully formed. They inherited it from generations who understood how to make stone behave predictably in a demanding landscape. Those early builders left no names, but they left foundations that worked. And because those foundations worked, later architects could build upward with confidence. Stelae could rise, temples could endure, cities could expand. Nothing here is accidental. The prehistoric sites show us that the Aksumite kingdom was not a sudden achievement. It was the visible phase of a much longer process, one where engineering knowledge accumulated quietly until it was ready to support empire. As the Highland wind moves across these ancient platforms today, the stones remain understated, almost invisible to those looking only for spectacle. But they are the reason anything else stood at all. They remind us that history often celebrates the final form while forgetting the groundwork. Yet it is the groundwork that carries everything. And in the case of the Aksumite world, that groundwork was laid carefully, patiently, and with a level of understanding that does not need exaggeration to be impressive. It simply needs to be noticed. Deakis Delta stone spheres. In the wide, low-lying floodplains of southern Costa Rica, where rivers fan outward before reaching the Pacific and the ground shifts subtly with each rainy season, there are stone objects that do not fit easily into any familiar category of ancient architecture. They are not walls. They are not tools. They are not sculptures in the usual sense. They are spheres. Perfectly rounded, carefully shaped stone spheres, ranging from the size of a human head to massive forms weighing many tons, scattered across the landscape of the Dikis Delta. At first, they seem simple, almost playful, but simplicity here is deceptive, because creating a sphere is one of the most demanding tasks in stoneworking. These are the Dikis Delta stone spheres. Unlike monuments that rely on stacking or carving flat surfaces, a sphere requires uniform precision in every direction. Any miscalculation becomes immediately visible. There are no edges to hide behind, no planes to correct later. Every angle must agree with every other angle. The stone spheres of the Dikis Delta were created by the pre-Columbian cultures of southern Costa Rica, likely between 300 and 1500 CE. They were made primarily from granodiorite, an extremely hard, coarse-grained igneous rock. Granodiorite does not forgive mistakes. Shaping it requires repeated heating, controlled fracture, grinding, and polishing over long periods. There is no shortcut. You remove material slowly, checking curvature constantly. To stop too early ruins symmetry. To go too far ruins the stone. The fact that so many spheres achieved near-perfect roundness suggests not experimentation, but mastery. The stones were quarried from distant mountain sources and transported to the delta. This alone required logistical planning. Moving heavy, rounded stones across uneven terrain without wheels or draft animals demands coordination, labor, and timing. The builders understood routes. They understood seasons. They likely waited for dry ground, controlled descent along slopes, and stabilized movement using wooden frameworks and human force. This was not improvisation. It was organized effort. What makes the Dikis spheres especially challenging to interpret is their placement. Some were found in clusters, others in linear arrangements. Some appeared to have marked boundaries or important spaces. Others stood alone. They were not randomly discarded. They were positioned. Early excavations disrupted many original contexts, but enough evidence remains to show that placement mattered. In some cases, spheres aligned with natural features, pathways, or constructed platforms. This suggests spatial meaning rather than decoration. The spheres are often interpreted symbolically, as markers of power, cosmology, or status. But regardless of meaning, what matters architecturally is the decision to invest immense effort into objects that do not perform obvious practical functions. They do not support weight. They do not block movement. They do not store resources. Their purpose was conceptual, and conceptual architecture still requires engineering discipline. The smoothness of the spheres reveals controlled finishing. Surfaces were polished, not left rough. This polishing reduced weathering and slowed erosion, especially important in a humid, flood-prone environment. The builders anticipated climate. Granodiorite weathers slowly, but uneven surfaces trap moisture and encourage biological growth. Smooth surfaces shed water. The spheres remain legible today because they were finished properly. This attention to finishing indicates long-term thinking. The spheres were not meant to be temporary markers. They were meant to persist in place, resisting both environmental decay and visual distortion. Spherical form also resists structural stress. There are no weak corners. Pressure distributes evenly across the surface. Even if partially buried or shifted by flooding, a sphere remains intact. This resilience is not accidental. The builders selected a form that cooperates with time rather than fighting it. Standing near one of the larger spheres today, the effect is subtle but powerful. There is no narrative carved into the stone, no instruction, no explanation. The object simply occupies space with certainty. It draws attention without demanding it. This quality likely mattered in the past as well. In an open landscape, a perfect sphere stands out immediately. It signals intention. Someone shaped this deliberately. The effort required to create one sphere would have been enormous. Creating many suggests shared values and collective labor. This was not the work of isolated artisans. It was communal. The spheres may have marked important places, residences of elites, ceremonial centers, or territorial boundaries. Whatever their specific function, they communicate control of labor, resources, and knowledge. Power here is expressed through restraint, not through size alone, not through ornament, but through precision. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Dicas delta stones matter because they force us to reconsider what counts as engineering. There are no walls to measure, no loads to calculate. And yet, the precision required rivals that of complex architecture. The builders had to understand stone behavior, fracture patterns, surface finishing, transport logistics, and spatial placement. They had to coordinate people over long periods for results that did not immediately improve survival. This suggests stability. You do not invest in symbolic precision unless your society is secure enough to do so. The eventual abandonment of the Dicas region did not erase the spheres. Some were buried by sediment, others were moved or damaged, but many survived intact. They endured because their form allowed it. No joints to fail, no corners to break, no load. Paths to collapse. Just mass and balance. The spheres also challenge assumptions about technological progression. Perfect spherical stonework appears here without metal tools, without written geometry, and without external influence from known Old World tradition. Ring of Brodgar. On a narrow strip of land between two lochs in the Orkney Islands, where water reflects the sky almost constantly and the wind never fully rests, there is a circular arrangement of stone that does not behave like a monument. It behaves like a decision. This is the Ring of Brodgar. There are no walls here, no roofs, no interior chambers meant to shelter anyone from the weather. And yet, this place was engineered with a level of commitment that rivals any enclosed structure of the Neolithic world. The Ring of Brodgar is a henge, a vast circular enclosure defined by a deep ditch and a ring of standing stones, originally numbering around 60. What remains today is incomplete, but the logic of the site is still unmistakable. This was not built quickly, and it was not built casually. The ditch surrounding the ring is more than 3 meters deep and over 9 meters wide, cut directly into bedrock using stone and antler tools. No defensive function explains this. Effort. The ditch is inside the stone circle, not outside. It does not protect the stones from intruders. It defines space. Excavating bedrock on this scale without metal tools requires planning, endurance, and coordination. The builders removed thousands of tons of material for a feature that does not serve survival needs in any obvious way. That alone tells us something important. The Ring of Brodgar was not about utility. It was about control of space and meaning. The stones themselves are tall, thin slabs of local sandstone, shaped minimally but positioned with care. They are not uniform. Each stone differs slightly in height, width, and profile. And yet, together they form a circle of remarkable accuracy. Perfect symmetry was not the goal. Consistency was. The circle measures approximately 104 meters in diameter. Achieving this without formal measuring tools required a shared system of reference, likely based on pacing, chords, and repeated verification. Errors would accumulate quickly in a project of this size. They did not accumulate. This tells us the builders checked their work constantly. The placement of the ring is equally revealing. It sits between the Loch of Stennis and the Loch of Harry, with sightlines that connect it to other major Neolithic sites, including the stones of Stennis, Maeshowe, and surrounding settlements. The Ring of Brodgar does not stand alone. It is part of a landscape-scale design. Movement through this landscape would have been intentional. Approaches to the ring are gradual. The stones emerge slowly rather than suddenly. There is no single grand entrance. Access is diffuse, encouraging circulation rather than procession. This suggests that the experience mattered as much as the destination. Standing inside the ring today, sound behaves differently. Wind moves across the stones unevenly. Voices carry, but not predictably. The ditch separates interior space subtly, creating a psychological boundary, without blocking vision. You are not enclosed. You are marked as inside. This distinction matters. The ring does not trap participants, it frames them. The stones themselves do not support anything. They hold no roof. They bear no weight beyond their own mass. Their function is spatial and perceptual rather than structural. And yet, their foundations are deep and stable. Each stone was set into the ground carefully, anchored to prevent tilting or collapse. Some stones lean today, but they remain upright after thousands of years of wind and frost. That endurance was planned. The builders understood soil behavior, freeze-thaw cycles, and stone stability in a northern climate. Shallow placement would have failed quickly. Deep placement required more effort, but ensured longevity. They chose longevity. The ring of Brodgar also reveals restraint. The stones are not carved with symbols. There is no decoration to interpret. Meaning was created through placement, scale, and repetition, rather than imagery. This choice allows meaning to remain flexible. Different generations could bring different interpretations without altering the structure. The ring could host ceremonies, gatherings, negotiations, or observations without being locked to a single narrative. This adaptability likely contributed to its long use. In a series exploring ancient structures that challenge modern assumptions, the Ring of Brodgar matters because it demonstrates that engineering is not limited to enclosed or load-bearing architecture. Here, engineering organizes human behavior, movement, and perception. Space itself is the structure. The effort invested here suggests that Neolithic communities valued shared experience enough to justify massive labor. You do not build a ring like this for a single event. You build it because you expect return. The ring likely functioned over centuries, possibly longer. It would have anchored seasonal gatherings, reinforced social bonds, and connected communities across Orkney through shared participation. Stone here replaces writing. It records presence. The eventual decline of the ring's use did not result from structural failure. The stones remained. The ditch held. What changed were social systems, beliefs, and priorities. The architecture endured. That endurance is not accidental. The ring was not pushed to material limits. Stones were tall, but not too tall. Spacing allowed flexibility. Foundations allowed movement without collapse. The builders worked within what stone and soil could tolerate. This discipline is why the ring still exists. Standing within it today, the experience is quiet rather than dramatic. There is no central focal point demanding attention. The horizon remains visible. The sky remains dominant. The ring does not compete with nature. It collaborates with it. This collaboration is perhaps its most important lesson. The builders did not attempt to impose meaning through mass or height. They shaped a place where meaning could emerge repeatedly through use. That is a different kind of permanence. The Ring of Brodgar does not ask us to imagine lost technologies or forgotten sciences. It asks us to recognize something simpler and more profound. That ancient people understood how to shape space in ways that endure socially as well as physically. They understood that stone does not need to enclose to define. That boundaries can be psychological as well as physical. That repetition can be more powerful than monumentality. The ring remains because it was never rigid. It allowed people to move, gather, and interpret without forcing a single outcome. As the wind continues to cross the Orkney Isthmus and the lochs continue to reflect changing skies, the stones of Brodgar remain standing, not as a puzzle demanding answers, but as evidence of careful choices made by people who knew exactly what they wanted this place to be. Not a building, not a fortress, not a shrine, enclosed from the world, but a circle carved into the landscape itself, a place where stone, sky, and human presence were brought into alignment, and left that way patiently until time itself learned to move around it.